Vienna, 1896. A young neurologist sits alone in his study, the gaslight flickering against mahogany shelves. Rain taps against the window. He has just returned from a lecture where his colleagues laughed at him openly when he proposed that hysteria might arise not from wandering wombs or weak nerves, but from buried memories of childhood trauma. His name is Sigmund Freud, and he is about to change everything we think we know about the human mind. But here is the question that will occupy us for the next hours together. What if everything you believe about yourself, your choices, your loves, your fears, is being written by a part of you that you can never fully see? What if you are, in the truest sense, a stranger to yourself? Freud's work emerged from a simple, shattering insight. Consciousness is not the whole story. Beneath the surface of your waking thoughts lies an entire continent of desires, memories, and conflicts you have forgotten or never knew you had. And from that hidden realm, your life is being shaped in ways both subtle and profound. This is not a journey through dry theory. This is a map of the territory you walk through every day without realizing it, the dream you forgot by morning, the word that slipped out when you meant to say another, the person you fall in love with for reasons you cannot name, the anger that surprises even you. All of it has a logic, a structure, an archaeology, and Freud spent 50 years excavating it. Tonight, we will move slowly through the architecture of the mind he revealed, not as a museum tour, but as an exploration of your own inner landscape. We will meet the forces that drive you, the defenses that protect you, the compromises you make between desire and reality, between instinct and civilization. We will encounter ideas that disturbed the world when Freud first spoke them, and we will see why, more than a century later, they still whisper truths we would rather not hear. Because here is what Freud understood. We are not rational creatures who occasionally feel. We are feeling creatures who occasionally think, and most of what we feel in the dark. So let yourself settle into this space. Let the concepts wash over you like water. Some will be familiar, others will feel strange, even unsettling. That is as it should be. Freud's gift was discomfort, the discomfort of recognition. The mind, he showed us, is not a unified self. It is a theater of competing desires, a parliament where members shout over one another and strike secret deals. And the you that you call yourself, that is only the spokesperson, not the author. But if we can learn to listen to the dreams, the slips, the symptoms, the resistances, we can begin to hear the voices that have been speaking all along. We begin with a man who dared to ask what we hide from ourselves, and why. Before Freud, there was only neurology and philosophy, bodies and souls. The brain was a machine of nerves and fluids. The soul was the domain of priests and poets. Between them, nothing. Freud was trained as a physician. He studied eels and cocaine, neurons and reflexes. He believed, as his teachers believed, that all mental phenomena could eventually be reduced to biology, that one day we would map every thought to a chemical trace, every emotion to a nerve pathway. But then he met the patients that medicine could not cure. Women who could not walk, though their legs were whole. Men who could not see, though their eyes were clear. Paralyses with no physical cause, blindnesses that appeared and disappeared like weather. The medical term was hysteria. The doctors shrugged, malingering, feminine weakness, attention-seeking. Freud looked closer. He traveled to Paris to study with Jean-Martin Charcot, who demonstrated that hysterical symptoms could be induced and removed through hypnosis. If a suggestion could create a paralysis, then the paralysis was not in the body, it was in the mind. But where in the mind, and why? Back in Vienna, Freud partnered with Joseph Breuer, an older physician who had treated a remarkable patient named Anna O. She suffered from a constellation of symptoms: paralysis, hallucinations, inability to speak her native German. Under hypnosis, she would recall traumatic memories, speak of them, and her symptoms would lift. She called it the talking cure. Breuer called it catharsis. Freud saw something more. He saw that the memories that caused symptoms were not random. They were always connected to experiences the patient had tried to forget, painful events, shameful desires, conflicts too unbearable to face. The mind, he realized, does not simply forget. It represses. It takes what it cannot tolerate and pushes it down, locks it away, buries it beneath the floorboards of consciousness. But what is buried does not disappear. It festers. It transforms. And eventually it finds another way to speak. Through the body, through symptoms, through dreams. This was the birth of psychoanalysis, the recognition that mental suffering is meaningful, that a symptom is not a malfunction, but a message, a disguised communication from the parts of ourselves we have disowned. But this revelation cost Freud dearly. Breuer, his mentor and friend, abandoned the work when it became too disturbing. The medical establishment mocked him. His early claims that hysteria stemmed from childhood sexual trauma were met with outrage. He was accused of inventing perversity where there was only innocence. And so Freud entered the loneliest phase of his career, isolated, doubted, working late into the night with only his own dreams and neuroses as laboratory. It was during this self-analysis, this courageous and terrifying descent into his own unconscious, that he discovered the principles that would define his life's work. He learned to interpret his dreams. He traced his own resistances. He uncovered wishes he had never admitted, even to himself. And slowly, painstakingly, he built a new science from the inside out. Psychoanalysis was not invented in a laboratory. It was forged in solitude, in courage, in the willingness of one man to face what he found when he looked within. And what he found there was not madness. It was structure, pattern, law. The unconscious, he came to see, is not chaos. It is a kingdom with its own logic, its own language, its own relentless purpose. And if we learn to read that language, we can begin to make sense of the seemingly senseless. This is where our journey truly begins, with the recognition that beneath your ordinary awareness, another mind is at work, ancient, amoral, tireless, and it has been shaping you since before you could speak. Imagine a house. You live on the second floor. Bright windows, clean walls, everything you can name and touch and see. This is your conscious mind, the place you call home. But below you, beneath the floorboards, there is a basement, vast, unlit, filled with things you have never seen, but that are always there, always humming, old furniture, locked trunks. Things you put down there years ago and forgot you owned. This is the unconscious, and it is not smaller than the house above. It is larger, infinitely larger. The conscious mind, Freud proposed, is only the tip of the iceberg. The rest, the vast submerged mass, is hidden beneath the surface of awareness. Yet it is this hidden part that provides the weight, the momentum, the direction of your life. You do not believe this at first. You think, I know my own mind. I know why I do what I do. But then a dream surprises you. A word slips out that you did not intend. You fall in love with someone who reminds you, though you cannot say how, of someone else. You find yourself afraid of something that poses no rational threat, angry at someone who has done nothing wrong. These are the fingerprints of the unconscious. Freud divided the mind into regions. The conscious, what you are aware of right now. The preconscious, memories and thoughts you can easily recall when you try. And the unconscious, everything else. The wishes you have disowned, the traumas you have buried, the desires that contradict your self-image. But the unconscious is not passive. It does not simply store old data like a forgotten file cabinet. It is dynamic and active. It wants, it pushes, it demands. And when its demands cannot be met directly, it finds other routes. This is the key. The unconscious does not think in words. It thinks in images, in symbols, in feelings that bypass logic. It knows nothing of time past and present exist together, layered like transparencies. It knows nothing of contradiction. You can love and hate the same person in the same instant. It knows nothing of morality. It wants what it wants, with the intensity of a child, the persistence of the tide. And so it speaks in code. In dreams, yes, but also in jokes, in errors, in forgetting and remembering, in the choice of whom you trust and whom you fear, in the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Freud's great discovery was not that the unconscious exists. Philosophers and poets had long suspected something beneath the surface. His discovery was that the unconscious is lawful, that it can be studied, that its language can be learned. He called this the psychical apparatus, a term that sounds mechanical, but describes something fluid and strange. The mind, he proposed, is an energy system. Mental energy, he called it libido, though he meant it more broadly than sexual energy flows through this system, seeking discharge, seeking satisfaction. When the path is blocked, the energy does not vanish. It finds another outlet. It converts into anxiety, into obsession, into symptom. Think of a river dammed. The water must go somewhere. It pools, it floods, it carves new channels through the landscape, channels that were never meant to be there. So too with desire. The unconscious, then, is not the enemy of the conscious mind. It is its root, its source, the place where meaning is made before meaning has words. To understand yourself, Freud insisted, you must learn to listen to what you did not know you were saying, to read the hieroglyphs of your own depths. But this is not easy work, because the unconscious does not want to be known, or rather, part of you does not want it to be known. There are good reasons you buried what you buried. Revealing it will bring pain, conflict, shame, and so the mind resists, defends, distracts. We are coming to that, to the mechanisms by which you protect yourself from yourself. But first, we must go deeper still into the most famous of Freud's discoveries, the place where the unconscious speaks most clearly, most nightly, to anyone willing to listen. We must turn to dreams, and to the royal road they offer into the hidden country of the mind. Every night you leave the world, you close your eyes, and another reality opens, a theater you did not build, staging plays you did not write. You walk through cities that do not exist. You speak to people who are dead. You commit acts you would never consider, feel desires you would never admit, and then, in the morning, it vanishes like smoke. For most of history, dreams were seen as messages from gods or demons, omens, prophecies, or else they were dismissed as meaningless noise, the random firing of a tired brain, signifying nothing. Freud offered a third possibility: dreams are wishes. Not all wishes are pleasant, not all are simple, but every dream, he argued, is an attempt by the unconscious mind to fulfill a desire that cannot be fulfilled in waking life. The dream is a safety valve, a nocturnal theater where forbidden impulses are staged, disguised, and satisfied in symbolic form. This was the central claim of the Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899 to near total silence. The book sold fewer than 400 copies in its first 6 years. It was ignored by the scientific establishment, mocked by reviewers, and yet Freud believed, rightly, that it contained his most important insights. He would later write that such a book comes only once in a lifetime, if at all. What made it revolutionary was not the idea that dreams have meaning. It was the method for uncovering that meaning. For Freud, dreams are not transparent allegories. They are not puzzles with a single correct answer. They are overdetermined, layered with multiple meanings, condensed and displaced, woven from threads of memory, desire, and conflict. To interpret a dream, you cannot rely on a dream dictionary that tells you a snake always means one thing, a house another. You must trace the dream back to its sources in the dreamer's life. You must ask, what did I experience yesterday? What am I worried about? What am I ashamed of? What do I want that I cannot admit? The dream, Freud proposed, has 2 layers: the manifest content, what you remember, the surface story, and the latent content, the hidden wishes beneath. The work of the dream is to transform the latent into the manifest, to smuggle forbidden desires past the censor that guards the gateway between unconscious and conscious. How does it do this? Through the dream work, a set of processes that disguise and distort, making the unacceptable acceptable enough to be dreamed. Condensation, multiple thoughts and images compressed into one. A person in the dream who is somehow both your father and your boss and a childhood friend. A place that is simultaneously your old house and a hospital and a hotel you once stayed in. Displacement, emotional intensity shifted from its true target to something safer. You dream of losing your wallet when what you fear is losing your worth. You dream of missing a train when what you dread is missing your chance at happiness. Symbolization, abstract ideas transformed into concrete images, climbing a staircase, opening a door, a room with many entrances, water, fire, flight. The unconscious thinks in pictures, and so the dream speaks in metaphor. And then there is secondary revision, the process by which the dreaming mind tries to impose a narrative on the chaos, to make the strange images cohere into something like a story. This is the part you are most likely to remember, because it feels the most logical, but it is also the most superficial layer, the cosmetic work of a mind trying to hide its own depths. Freud worked with his patients' dreams the way a detective works with clues. He asked them to free associate, to say whatever comes to mind when they think of each element of the dream. A man dreams of a dog. What does the dog remind him of? His childhood pet. And that pet? His father who gave it to him. And his father? A figure he both loved and feared. And so the dream of the dog opens into a web of associations, leading back to unresolved feelings about authority, love, and fear. This is the royal road Freud spoke of, not a highway with clear signs, but a winding path through forest, requiring patience and attention. Each dream is a door, but you must learn to pick the lock. For Freud himself, the dream that unlocked everything came in the summer of 1895. He called it the dream of Irma's injection. In the dream, he examined a patient who was not improving, and other doctors blamed him. He looked into her throat and saw horrible formations. He traced the cause to an injection given carelessly by a colleague. On the surface, professional anxiety, a fear of being blamed, but as he analyzed his associations, he uncovered deeper currents: guilt over his own ambitions, anger at colleagues who dismissed his work, a wish to be vindicated, a wish, in fact, for someone else to be at fault so that he could be blameless. The dream, he realized, was not a photograph of reality. It was a wish fulfillment, a fantasy in which his professional failures could be explained away by external causes. In the dream, he got what he wanted: absolution. And so dreams, Freud concluded, are not random, they are purposeful. They serve the pleasure principle, the mind's relentless drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But they serve it in disguise, because the wishes they fulfill are often forbidden, shameful, or dangerous to acknowledge. Which brings us to the question that must follow. If the mind goes to such lengths to disguise its wishes, what exactly is it hiding, and why must it hide at all? There is a dream, Freud recounts. A father sits by the bedside of his sick child. Exhausted, he falls asleep in the adjoining room. A candle tips over in the room where the child's body lies. Fire begins to spread. The father dreams that his child comes to him, tugs at his arm, and whispers, "Father, don't you see? I'm burning." The father wakes in terror. He runs into the room. The cloth covering the child's body is in flames. Why did the father dream? Why did his mind construct this scene? Freud's answer: because the dream allowed him a few more seconds of sleep. The smell of smoke, the heat, the danger, all were working to wake him. But the mind, ever ingenious, wove these stimuli into a dream so that the father could remain asleep just a moment longer. The wish to stay asleep. The method: transform the external danger into a narrative. But there is something deeper here. The dream also gave the father what no waking moment could: a final encounter with his child, a chance to hear the child speak one more time. The dream fulfilled a wish that reality had made impossible. This is the double nature of wish fulfillment. It is not always about pleasure in the simple sense. It is about what the mind needs, what it longs for, what it cannot relinquish. Even a nightmare can be a wish, because sometimes what we wish for is to punish ourselves, to see the catastrophe we fear, to rehearse the loss before it arrives. Freud believed that every dream represents the fulfillment of an unconscious wish, not necessarily a wish we would endorse, not always a wish we would recognize as our own, but a wish nonetheless. And the reason dreams are so strange, so illogical, so often disturbing, is that the wishes they fulfill are in conflict with our waking values. Consider a woman who dreams she is at a party where her best friend's husband flirts with her. She is horrified in the dream, tries to leave, but doors keep appearing that lead only to more rooms. She wakes feeling guilty, confused. Why would she dream such a thing? The latent content, the hidden wish, might be jealousy or curiosity about what her friend has, or an old desire she thought she had outgrown, or anger at her friend for some small slight now expressed in symbolic betrayal. The manifest content, the surface story disguises this wish behind a narrative of resistance. In the dream, she tries to leave. She is not complicit. And so the wish is fulfilled and denied at the same time. This is what Freud called compromise formation. The dream is a negotiation between the wish and the defense against the wish, between what you want and what you believe you should want. The unconscious says, I desire this. The censor says, you cannot have this. And the dream says, very well, I will give you a version so disguised that you will not recognize it. And so you can have it without knowing you have it. It is an act of extraordinary creativity. The dream work is not stupid. It is brilliant. It finds the loophole. It satisfies both parties. It lets you eat the cake and deny you were ever hungry. But what happens when we begin to decode these disguises? What happens when the latent content is revealed? For some, there is relief. A symptom loses its power when the wish behind it is named. A fear diminishes when its source is traced. This is the therapeutic aim of dream analysis, not to eliminate the unconscious, but to bring its contents into dialogue with consciousness, to allow the wish to be acknowledged, examined, and either integrated or released. For others, there is resistance, a tightening, a refusal, because if the dream is a disguise, it is a disguise for a reason. The truth beneath may be unbearable, and the mind will do anything to keep it hidden. This brings us to one of Freud's most important concepts, the one that explains why therapy is slow, why insight is hard-won, why we sabotage our own healing. We must speak now of repression, and the fortress walls the mind builds to protect itself from what it knows but cannot bear to know. You do not forget where you left your keys because your unconscious is hiding them, but you might forget a dentist appointment you dread. You might lose track of time on a day you promised to have a difficult conversation. You might blank on the name of someone who once hurt you. This is not random. This is repression. Repression is the foundational defense mechanism, the mother of all the others. It is the process by which the mind takes a thought, a memory, a desire too painful or dangerous to hold in consciousness, and pushes it down into the unconscious, out of sight, out of mind, or so it seems. But here is the paradox. What is repressed does not go away. It remains active and insistent, like a hand pressing against a door you are holding shut. And the energy you spend keeping that door closed is energy you cannot use elsewhere. You grow tired, anxious, symptomatic, and you do not know why. Freud came to see repression as the engine of neurosis. A person becomes neurotic not because they have unacceptable desires, we all do, but because they cannot tolerate knowing they have them, and so they push them away, again and again, at great cost. A man who feels unconscious rage toward his father cannot let that rage surface. It would shatter his self-image as a dutiful son, and so he represses it. But the rage does not vanish. It leaks out as migraines, as inexplicable irritability toward authority figures, as dreams of violence he cannot explain. A woman who longs for freedom from her marriage cannot admit this longing. It contradicts her values, her vows, her identity as a loving wife, and so she represses it. But the longing persists. It manifests as chronic fatigue, as a vague dissatisfaction she cannot name, as fantasies of disappearance. Repression is motivated forgetting, and it is expensive, because you are not simply hiding something from others, you are hiding it from yourself. Freud distinguished repression from suppression. Suppression is conscious. You feel anger and choose not to express it. You notice an attraction and deliberately set it aside. This is a mature capacity, a choice. Repression, by contrast, is unconscious. You do not know you are doing it. The thought never fully arrives. It is intercepted before it reaches awareness. But the mind does not stop at repression. It builds layers of protection. If repression is the first defense, resistance is what happens when that defense is threatened. Resistance is the force that opposes the therapeutic process. The part of you that does not want to get better, or rather does not want to face what getting better would require you to face. This was one of Freud's most counterintuitive observations. Patients came to him for help. They paid him, they scheduled sessions, they spoke for hours, and yet, at the crucial moments, they forgot what they were about to say. They changed the subject. They joked. They arrived late. They cancelled. They argued with interpretations. They insisted that a memory could not possibly be important. At first, Freud was frustrated. Why would someone seeking relief actively sabotage the process? Then he understood, because getting better means relinquishing the symptom, and the symptom, however painful, is serving a purpose. It is solving a problem. It is saying something the person cannot say directly, and to give it up is to face the conflict that created it in the first place. The symptom is a compromise, and compromise, however uncomfortable, is safer than confrontation. So resistance takes many forms. Intellectualization. The patient analyzes everything but feels nothing. Minimization. It's not that big a deal. Distraction. Talking endlessly about trivial matters to avoid the real issue. Silence. The most direct form of resistance. The refusal to speak at all. Freud learned to read resistance the way a sailor reads the wind. Where there is resistance, there is something important nearby. The patient who cannot stop talking about their mother is avoiding something about their father. The patient who insists a memory is meaningless has just told you it is crucial. Resistance is a map. It shows you where the buried treasure lies. But resistance is not the enemy. It is a guardian. It arose to protect the person from overwhelming pain, and it must be respected, even as it is gently, patiently dissolved. This is the art of psychoanalysis. Not to attack the defenses, but to make them unnecessary, to create a space safe enough that what has been hidden can finally be revealed. And what is revealed, more often than not, takes us back to the beginning, back to childhood, to the place where the conflicts that shape our adult lives first took root. The mind, Freud proposed, is not a thing. It is a process, a system of forces in motion, in conflict, in constant negotiation. To understand it, we must think not in terms of parts, but of dynamics, of energy seeking discharge, of pressure and release, of equilibrium disturbed and restored. Imagine a river. The water flows downhill, always seeking the path of least resistance. But place a dam in its way, and the water pools. Pressure builds. Eventually, the water finds a route over the dam, around it, through cracks in the foundation. The energy must go somewhere. It cannot simply vanish. So too with the psyche. Mental energy libido flows through the system, seeking satisfaction. When direct satisfaction is possible, the energy is discharged smoothly. A hunger is fed, a desire is fulfilled, tension is released. But when satisfaction is blocked by external reality, by internal prohibition, by moral constraint, the energy does not disappear, it accumulates, and it seeks alternative outlets. This is the economic model of the mind, a model that treats psychic life as an energy system governed by principles of tension and discharge. The pleasure principle drives the system toward the reduction of tension, toward the release of accumulated excitation. But the reality principle imposes limits, delays, detours. And so the psyche becomes a site of negotiation between desire and possibility. Freud saw conflict as fundamental, not incidental, not pathological, but structural, built into the very architecture of being human. We are not unified selves. We are coalitions of competing impulses. And the self we think we are, the coherent I, is the result of countless unconscious compromises. Consider guilt. On the surface, guilt seems simple. You did something wrong, and you feel bad about it. But for Freud, guilt is a dynamic process. There is the wish to act. There is the prohibition against that wish. When the wish is strong and the prohibition is strong, the result is conflict. If the wish is repressed, the conflict goes underground, but the energy remains. And it finds expression as guilt, even when the action was never taken, even when the wish was never conscious. This is why a person can feel guilty without knowing why a child can feel they have done something terrible when they have done nothing at all. The guilt is not about the action, it is about the wish, and the wish, because it is unconscious, cannot be examined, challenged, or outgrown. Freud also spoke of psychical determinism. Every thought, every feeling, every slip of the tongue has a cause. Nothing is random, nothing is accidental. The joke you tell, the name you forget, the time you arrive late, all are meaningful, all are traceable to unconscious motives if you know how to look. This was a radical claim in his time and remains unsettling now. It means you are less in control than you believe, that your reasons for doing things are often not your real reasons, that you are, in a sense, a puppet to forces you cannot see. But Freud's aim was not to demoralize, it was to liberate, because if the forces are lawful, they can be studied, and if they can be studied, they can, to some extent, be mastered. The dynamics of the psyche are also temporal. The past does not stay in the past. Early experiences lay down patterns, templates of desire, fear, attachment, that repeat throughout life. You fall in love with the same kind of person again and again. You find yourself in the same kind of conflict with different bosses. You react to a stranger with an intensity that belongs to someone else, someone from long ago. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the uncanny tendency to recreate the past, even when the past was painful. Why would someone do this? Because the unconscious is trying to master the trauma, to get it right this time, to rewrite the ending, but without awareness the repetition is blind, the trauma is reenacted, not resolved. And so the psyche is a theater where old scripts are performed over and over, with new actors, on new stages, until someone finally stops and asks, "Why am I doing this? What am I trying to say? What wound am I trying to heal?" These are the questions analysis asks, and to answer them we need a method, a way to bypass the defenses, to slip past the censor, to let the unconscious speak in its own voice. Freud found that method, and it remains, to this day, one of the most powerful tools for accessing the hidden mind. Lie down on the couch. Face the ceiling. Let your gaze soften. The analyst sits behind you, out of sight. This is not cruelty, it is strategy. Without the analyst's face to read, without the pressure of eye contact, you are freer to speak, freer to wander, freer to say what you would not say if you were looking at another person. Now, say whatever comes to mind. This is the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis. Free association, do not censor, do not edit, do not worry about coherence or relevance or propriety. Follow the thread of your thoughts wherever it leads. From the dream you had last night, to the smell of coffee, to the argument with your spouse, to a memory from childhood you have not thought of in years. Trust the process. Trust that the unconscious knows where to go. Freud abandoned hypnosis early in his career. He found it unreliable. Some patients could not be hypnotized. Others would recall memories under trance but forget them upon waking. And hypnosis, he realized, maintained the power imbalance. The analyst was an authority imposing suggestions. The patient was passive, helpless. Free association inverted the dynamic. The patient became the expert on their own mind. The analyst was merely a guide, listening for patterns, noting resistances, offering interpretations when the time was right. But free association is harder than it sounds. You begin, you speak, and within minutes you are stuck. A thought arrives that feels too trivial to mention, or too embarrassing, or too dangerous, and you skip over it. You move to something safer. You pause. You apologize. You say, "This probably isn't important." And the analyst says gently, "Say it anyway." Because that is precisely where the work lies. In the thought you almost did not say, in the detail that embarrasses you, in the image that makes no sense. The unconscious is not logical. It does not value the same things your conscious mind values. A trivial detail can be the hinge on which an entire structure of meaning turns. Free association reveals the hidden connections between thoughts. A patient talks about missing a train, then mentions a childhood toy, then a recent argument. On the surface, these seem unrelated, but the analyst listens for the thread. Missing the train, missing an opportunity. The toy, something precious that was lost. The argument, fear of losing again. And suddenly the patient is not talking about a train. They are talking about a lifelong fear of loss, rooted in an event they have not yet remembered. This is how interpretation works, not by imposing meaning from the outside, but by illuminating the meaning that is already there, hidden in plain sight. The analyst does not tell the patient what their unconscious is saying. The analyst helps the patient hear it for themselves. But interpretation must be timed. Offered too early, it is rejected. The patient is not ready. The defenses are still strong. Offered too late, the moment is lost. The insight must arrive when the patient is on the edge of knowing, when the unconscious material is pressing so close to consciousness that only a small nudge is needed to bring it into view. Freud described interpretation as a form of translation. The unconscious speaks in symbols. The analyst translates those symbols into words the conscious mind can understand. But this is not a mechanical process. It requires intuition, empathy, a feel for the patient's inner world. And it requires patience, because the unconscious does not reveal itself all at once. It offers fragments, hints, clues scattered across weeks or months of sessions. The analyst must hold these fragments in mind, waiting for the moment when they cohere into a pattern. One of Freud's patients spoke repeatedly of a dream in which she was in a house with many locked doors. She would try each door, but none would open. The analyst asked, "What are the doors keeping you from?" The patient did not know. Weeks later, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had recently remembered something her mother once told her, a family secret she was never supposed to speak of. And suddenly, the dream made sense. The locked doors were not keeping something out, they were keeping something in. The secret she carried, the knowledge she could not share. Interpretation is an art, and like all arts, it can be done well or badly. A clumsy interpretation alienates the patient. A brilliant one opens a door that has been locked for years. But interpretation is not the end. It is the beginning, because knowing is not the same as changing. Insight, Freud discovered, is necessary but not sufficient. The patient must also work through, must return again and again to the same conflicts, the same resistances, the same painful truths, until they are no longer overwhelming, until they are integrated, until they become simply part of the story, no longer the whole story. And this work requires something else, a relationship, a bond between patient and analyst that is unlike any other. A relationship that will inevitably become a theater for the very conflicts the patient is trying to understand. We are approaching one of Freud's most profound discoveries, the mechanism by which the past comes alive in the present, the way old attachments, old wounds, old loves and hates are transferred onto the analyst. We are approaching transference, and its shadow, counter-transference. Here is what Freud saw that no one before him had fully acknowledged. You are not born neutral. You are not born a blank slate waiting to be written on by experience. You are born wanting, born with drives, with needs, with a body that demands, and a mind that, slowly, learns to navigate those demands. And the first years of life before language, before memory, before you knew you were a self, are not a prelude. They are the foundation, the template, the origin of everything that follows. This was Freud's most controversial claim, that childhood is suffused with desire, that the infant is not innocent in the way we imagine innocence, that the bonds formed between child and caregiver are not simply about survival. They are about pleasure, about attachment, about the earliest stirrings of what will later become love, jealousy, guilt, and longing. Before Freud, children were seen as pre-sexual beings. Desire was something that awakened at puberty, as if a switch were flipped. Freud looked closer, and what he saw was a sexuality not in the adult sense, but in a broader sense, a drive toward pleasure, toward connection, toward the satisfaction of bodily needs that are inextricably linked with emotional bonds. The infant at the breast is not just feeding, the infant is experiencing pleasure. The warmth of the mother's body, the rhythm of sucking, the relief of hunger, all are sources of what Freud called libidinal satisfaction, and the mother becomes the first object of desire, the first love, the template for all future attachments. As the child grows, the zones of pleasure shift, the mouth at first. Then, as toilet training begins, the anus, the pleasure of retention and release, the first experience of control and conflict with authority. Later, the genitals, as the child discovers sensation and curiosity. These are the stages of psychosexual development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, each with its own conflicts, its own anxieties, its own potential for fixation. Fixation occurs when development is arrested, when a conflict at one stage is not resolved, and the person remains, in some part of their psyche, tied to that stage. An oral fixation might manifest as dependency, as a need for constant reassurance, as overeating or smoking attempts to recapture the primal comfort of the breast. An anal fixation might manifest as obsessive control, as rigidity, as a fear of mess or chaos. But beyond the stages, what matters is the relational matrix in which they unfold. The child does not develop in isolation. The child develops in response to caregivers, and the way those caregivers meet or fail to meet the child's needs shapes the architecture of the child's inner world. A child whose cries are consistently soothed learns trust. A child whose cries are ignored learns helplessness. A child who is smothered with attention learns anxiety. A child who is neglected learns to fend for themselves, to wall off need, to become self-sufficient at the cost of connection. These patterns are not chosen. They are adaptations, survival strategies, and they are encoded so deeply, so early, that they feel like nature rather than history. You do not remember learning them. You do not remember a time before them, and so you assume they are simply who you are. But Freud insisted, they are not who you are, they are who you became, and if they were learned, they can, potentially, be unlearned, or at least understood, held lightly rather than unconsciously enacted. The child also learns to navigate the social world, to distinguish self from other, to recognize that the mother is a separate being with her own desires, that the father exists and has a claim on the mother's attention, that there are rules, prohibitions, expectations, that some desires must be renounced, that love is never simple, that the world does not revolve around you. This is a series of losses, of disillusionments, and each loss leaves a trace, a longing for a time before the loss, a fantasy of reunion, a wound that never fully heals. Freud believed that adult neurosis is a return of the repressed, that the conflicts of childhood, unresolved, resurface in disguised form. The woman who cannot commit to a partner is reenacting the fear of losing her father's love if she grows up. The man who sabotages success is punishing himself for a guilt he does not remember. The chronic anxiety is a defense against desires that once felt dangerous, and so therapy becomes a kind of archaeology, digging through layers of sediment to reach the earliest strata, not to place blame, not to excuse, but to understand, to see how the past lives in the present, how the child you were still speaks through the adult you have become. This work is tender, it is slow, and it often leads to a revelation that is as disturbing as it is inevitable, a revelation Freud named, with characteristic boldness, after a Greek tragedy. We turn now to the Oedipus complex, to the family drama that, Freud believed, every child must navigate, and that, in some form, shapes the template of love and rivalry for the rest of life. Oedipus did not know. That is the heart of the tragedy. He did not know that the man he killed on the road was his father. He did not know that the woman he married was his mother. He solved the riddle of the Sphinx, but he could not solve the riddle of his own identity, and when the truth was revealed, it destroyed him. Freud saw in this myth a universal structure, a drama that every child, in their own way, enacts between the ages of 3 and 5. Not literally, not consciously, but symbolically, emotionally, in the theater of the family. Here is the child. The mother is the first love, the source of comfort and satisfaction. The father is a rival, a competitor for the mother's attention. The child wants the mother entirely. wants to possess her, wants to be the sole object of her love, and the father stands in the way. This is the Oedipal situation, a triangle, a conflict, and it is, Freud claimed, inevitable, because desire does not wait for social appropriateness. Desire simply wants, and the young child does not yet understand that some wants are impossible, that some loves are forbidden. But then the child begins to perceive danger. The father is larger, stronger, more powerful, and the child fears punishment for these forbidden desires. This fear, in boys, Freud called castration anxiety, not necessarily a literal fear, but a fear of loss, of diminishment, of being overpowered by the father's authority. And so the boy renounces his claim on the mother. He identifies with the father instead. He internalizes the father's authority, makes it his own, and channels his desire elsewhere, into pursuits and attachments that are socially acceptable. This is the resolution of the Oedipus complex, and it is the origin, Freud argued, of the superego, the internal voice of morality, of should and should not, of guilt and conscience. The superego is the father within, the internalized authority that says, you cannot have this, you must behave, you must be civilized. For girls, Freud proposed a parallel but distinct process, which he called the Electra complex, though he later abandoned the term. The girl's first love is also the mother, but at some point, the girl notices a difference, a lack. She perceives that she does not have a penis, and the mother does not have one, and this absence is experienced as a wound. Penis envy, Freud called it, a term that has been endlessly criticized, and rightly so. But what Freud was gesturing toward, however clumsily, was a sense of exclusion, a feeling that something valuable belongs to the father and the boy, and the girl is denied access to it. And so the girl's desire shifts from the mother to the father. She seeks to possess him, or to possess what he has, and eventually this desire too must be renounced. The Oedipus complex is, by any measure, Freud's most audacious theory, and it is the one that has met with the most resistance. Critics point out that it is patriarchal, heteronormative, biologically reductive, that it universalizes a dynamic that is specific to certain family structures, that it conflates symbolic and literal desire in ways that are misleading. All of this is true, and yet, if we step back from the literalism, something remains. The recognition that early family relationships are charged with intensity, that children do form powerful attachments to their caregivers, and that these attachments include not just love, but also rivalry, jealousy, and conflict. That the child must eventually renounce the fantasy of exclusive possession and accept the reality of a social world in which they are not the center. The Oedipus complex, in its essence, is about the transition from narcissism to socialization, from omnipotence to limits, from the pleasure principle to the reality principle. It is the story of how we learn, painfully, to live with others, to share, to defer, to accept that we cannot have everything we want. And for Freud, the way this transition is navigated, the severity of the conflict, the harshness of the prohibition, the presence or absence of understanding, shapes the person's relationship to authority, to intimacy, to guilt for the rest of their life. A person who never fully resolves the Oedipus complex may spend their life in symbolic competition with authority figures. They may struggle with intimacy because every partner evokes the early forbidden love and the guilt attached to it. They may carry a superego so harsh that they are never good enough in their own eyes. But Freud was not counsel of despair. He believed that becoming conscious of these patterns is the first step toward freedom, that you can revisit the old drama, understand it, and choose differently, that the past does not have to dictate the future. This is the promise of psychoanalysis, not to erase the past, but to integrate it, to make it speakable, to transform it from a force that controls you into a story you can tell. And yet, the Oedipus complex is only one part of the larger theory of childhood sexuality, a theory that shocked Freud's contemporaries and continues to provoke discomfort. We must confront it now, not because it is comfortable, but because it is foundational to Freud's understanding of human development. The idea that children are sexual beings was, in Freud's time, heretical. It violated the sanctity of childhood. It seemed to impute adult motives to innocent creatures. And yet Freud insisted, if we define sexuality broadly not as genital intercourse, but as the pursuit of bodily pleasure, the investment of energy in objects and relationships, the drive toward connection and satisfaction, then sexuality begins at birth. This is not perversion. It is not pathology. It is development. The child is, from the start, a creature of desire, not desire as we know it in adulthood, but desire nonetheless. The desire to be held, to be fed, to be soothed, to explore the sensations of the body, to find pleasure in warmth, in rhythm, in touch. Freud traced this development through the psychosexual stages. In the oral stage, pleasure centers on the mouth. The infant sucks, bites, tastes. Feeding is not just nutrition. It is an erotic act, in the broad sense a source of pleasure and connection. The breast or bottle is the first object, the first source of satisfaction outside the self. In the anal stage, pleasure shifts to the processes of elimination. The child learns to control the sphincter muscles, to hold in or let go. This is the child's first experience of autonomy, of power over the body, and it is also the first site of conflict with caregivers. Toilet training becomes a battleground. The child can comply or resist, can please or defy. And in this struggle, patterns of control and rebellion are established that echo throughout life. In the phallic stage, around ages 3 to 5, the child becomes aware of genital sensations, not in the service of reproduction, but as a source of pleasure and curiosity. The child notices differences between bodies, asks questions, explores, and this is the stage in which the Oedipus complex emerges, the recognition of the parents as objects of desire and rivalry. After the phallic stage comes latency, a period of relative quiescence. The sexual drives are sublimated into social activities, learning, friendships. The child focuses outward on mastering the world. But the drives do not disappear. They are merely dormant, waiting, and then, at puberty, they return in full force in the genital stage. Now the drives are organized around reproduction, around the search for a sexual partner. But the template was laid down long ago. The objects of desire, the patterns of attachment, the conflicts and anxieties, all are rooted in the early stages. This developmental framework was Freud's attempt to map the terrain of desire, to show that sexuality is not a discrete event that begins in adolescence. It is a continuous process, evolving and transforming, but always present. But Freud went further. He proposed that deviations from this developmental path, fixations, regressions, repressions, are the source of adult neuroses and perversions. A person fixated at the oral stage might seek constant oral gratification through eating, drinking, smoking, talking. A person fixated at the anal stage might become obsessively orderly, hoarding, controlling. A person who represses sexual curiosity might develop phobias or compulsions as symbolic substitutes. And here Freud made a claim that remains difficult, that what we call perversion is not a foreign pathology, but a variation on universal themes. That the drives that lead one person to normative sexuality could, under different circumstances, lead another to fetishism, voyeurism, or sadism. That the difference is not one of kind, but of degree and direction. This was not a moral claim. Freud was not endorsing harmful behavior. He was observing that the human psyche is polymorphously perverse meaning, capable of finding pleasure in a wide range of objects and activities, and that the channeling of this diffuse sexuality into socially accepted forms is the work of development, culture, and repression. For many, this is the most troubling aspect of Freud's theory. The suggestion that childhood is not innocent, that desire is not clean and simple, that we are all, in some sense, shaped by forces we would rather not acknowledge. But Freud's point was not to sexualize children in the predatory sense. It was to destigmatize the recognition that children have bodies, have needs, have feelings that are intense and complex. That ignoring this reality does not make it disappear. It only ensures that it will remain unconscious and therefore more powerful. To understand yourself as an adult, Freud believed, you must trace the lineage of your desires back to their origins, to see how early pleasures and prohibitions shaped what you now experience as natural preference, to recognize that your sexuality, your loves, your fears, all have a history, and that history is not deterministic. Knowing it does not imprison you, it frees you, because what is unconscious controls you, what is conscious you can work with. This brings us now to the structural model of the mind, the architecture Freud proposed in his later work. The famous triumvirate that has entered popular language, often misunderstood, but which remains one of his most enduring contributions. We turn to the id, the ego, and the superego. Picture a child standing before a display of candy in a store. The child wants the candy, wants it with a fierce, immediate hunger. The child does not think about money or rules or consequences. The child only knows, I want. This is the id. The id is the oldest part of the psyche, present from birth. It is pure drive, pure desire. It knows nothing of time, nothing of logic, nothing of morality. It operates according to the pleasure principle. Seek pleasure, avoid pain. It is the reservoir of instinctual energy, the source of all motivation. It is chaotic, demanding, insatiable. Freud described the id as a cauldron of seething excitations. It has no organization, no unified will. It is simply a collection of drives pushing toward discharge. The id wants food, warmth, sex, aggression, relief. It wants them now, and it does not care about the costs. But the child cannot simply take the candy. The world will not allow it. The parent will say no. The shopkeeper will intervene. There are rules. Reality imposes limits. And so another part of the mind develops to mediate between desire and reality. This is the ego. The ego is the executive. the part of the psyche that deals with the external world. It emerges in the first years of life as the child learns that not all desires can be immediately satisfied. That delay is sometimes necessary, that there are better and worse ways to achieve a goal. The ego operates according to the reality principle. It does not eliminate desire, it manages it. It finds pathways to satisfaction that take into account the constraints of the world. The ego says, "You want the candy, but if you take it, there will be consequences. So wait, ask, negotiate, or choose something else." The ego is rational, strategic, adaptive. It performs a balancing act, mediating between the id's demands, the superego's prohibitions, and the realities of the external world. It is, Freud said, like a rider on a horse. The horse, the id, provides the energy, the power, but the rider must guide the horse, must steer it, or else the horse will go wherever it pleases, regardless of danger. But the ego is not all-powerful. It is often overwhelmed. The id's demands are relentless. And there is another force, equally relentless, pressing from the opposite direction, the superego. The superego is the internal voice of morality. It is the part of the mind that says, "You should not want that. It is wrong. It is shameful. You are bad for wanting it." The superego emerges around age 5, during the resolution of the Oedipus complex, as the child internalizes the values and prohibitions of the parents and culture. The superego has two components, the conscience, the punitive voice that condemns and criticizes, and the ego ideal, the aspirational image of who you should be, the standard against which you measure yourself. Together they form the moral dimension of the psyche. The superego is not rational. It is absolute. It does not care about context or nuance. It judges. It condemns. And when you violate its rules, it punishes you with guilt. So the ego is caught in the middle. The id says, "I want." The superego says, "You must not." And reality says, "You cannot, or at least not now, not like that." The ego's job is to find a compromise, a way to satisfy the id without violating the superego, without crashing into the hard edges of reality. Most of the time, the ego succeeds. You feel a desire. You find a socially acceptable way to meet it. You move through the world without conflict. But sometimes the ego fails. The id is too strong, the superego too harsh, reality too unyielding. And when the ego cannot maintain the balance, anxiety erupts. This is Freud's later theory of anxiety. Anxiety is not simply fear of an external danger. It is a signal, a warning from the ego that it is being overwhelmed, that the balance is about to collapse. That repressed material is threatening to break through into consciousness. And when anxiety becomes unbearable, the ego deploys defenses, mechanisms to protect itself from being flooded. Repression, yes, but also others, denial, projection, rationalization, displacement, sublimation. We will explore these in the next chapter, but the key point is this: the mind is a battlefield, and the self you experience as unified as I is actually the temporary victor in a war that never ends. Freud's structural model has been criticized for being overly mechanistic, for treating the mind as if it were a machine with discrete parts. But the model was never meant to be literal. It was a metaphor, a way of describing the experience of internal conflict, the feeling of being pulled in multiple directions, the sense that you are not entirely in control of yourself, And the model explains something that the earlier topographical model, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, could not. It explains why conflict persists even when insight is achieved. Because it is not enough to make the unconscious conscious. The id will still want, the superego will still judge, the ego will still struggle. Psychoanalysis, in this framework, is not about eliminating the id or silencing the superego. It is about strengthening the ego, giving it more flexibility, more resources, more capacity to navigate the competing demands. It is about making the ego less rigid, less defensive, less enslaved to the past. Where Id was, Freud wrote, there ego shall be, meaning, where blind drive was, their reflective agency shall be. Not control, not mastery, but awareness, choice, the ability to say, I see this desire, I understand this prohibition, and I choose consciously how to respond. This is the goal. Not to be ruled by instinct, not to be paralyzed by guilt, but to be free enough to live. And this freedom requires understanding the principles that govern the psyche, the forces that push and pull, the compromises that shape experience, the dynamics of pleasure and pain. We turn now to the pleasure principle and the reality principle, to the fundamental laws that, for Freud, structure all mental life. At the core of Freud's thinking is a simple, stark observation. Organisms seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is not philosophy, it is biology. The nervous system is organized around the reduction of tension. Hunger creates tension, eating reduces it. Sexual arousal creates tension, orgasm releases it. Tension is unpleasant, release is pleasurable. And so the organism is driven always toward the reduction of tension, toward the restoration of equilibrium. This is the pleasure principle, the most fundamental drive of the psyche. It is not about hedonism in the moral sense. It is about the basic tendency of the mental apparatus to seek the discharge of excitation, the relief of unpleasure. The id operates entirely according to this principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. It does not think about consequences. It does not plan for the future. It simply pushes toward immediate gratification. But immediate gratification is not always possible. The breast is not always available. The desired object belongs to someone else. The impulse, if acted upon, would bring punishment. And so the child learns gradually, reluctantly to delay, to inhibit, to accept that satisfaction can be postponed. This is the reality principle, not the abolition of the pleasure principle, but its modification. The reality principle still aims at pleasure, but it takes a longer route. It accepts delay in order to secure a more reliable or more socially acceptable satisfaction. It trades immediate discharge for deferred gratification. It considers the consequences. The ego, as it develops, becomes the agent of the reality principle. It says to the id, yes, you want that, but if you take it now, you will suffer later. So wait, plan. Find another way. The ego does not eliminate desire, it manages it. It substitutes thought for action, planning for impulse. This is the mark of maturity, the ability to tolerate tension, to sit with unmet desire without collapsing into frustration or acting out, to hold the space between impulse and discharge long enough to think, to choose. But the reality principle is not easy. It requires effort. It requires the ability to represent the future, to imagine consequences, to weigh options. And it requires a certain amount of trust. Trust that satisfaction will eventually come, that delay is not abandonment. that the world is reliable enough to make planning worthwhile. For some, this trust never fully forms. Early experiences of deprivation or unpredictability teach the child that waiting is futile, that needs will not be met. And so the child clings to the pleasure principle, seeking immediate discharge wherever possible, unable to delay, unable to plan. This is one root of impulsivity, of addiction, of the inability to defer gratification that marks so much human suffering. For others, the reality principle becomes tyrannical. The child learns that desire itself is dangerous, that expressing need leads to punishment or shame. And so the child learns to suppress all impulse, to become hyper-controlled, to live entirely in the service of external demands. This is the overdeveloped ego, the person who cannot play, cannot relax, cannot let go. The healthy psyche, Freud suggested, maintains a balance. It can operate according to the reality principle when necessary, but it can also, in safe contexts, allow the pleasure principle to return, to play, to fantasize, to daydream, to make love, to lose oneself in art or music or humor. These are not regressions in the pejorative sense. They are necessary returns to primary process thinking, to the fluidity and creativity of the unconscious. Freud also distinguished between two types of mental processes: primary process, the mode of the unconscious, and the id, characterized by condensation, displacement, lack of negation, disregard for logic and time. It is the thinking of dreams, of symptoms, of jokes. It is imagistic, symbolic, associative. It seeks discharge along the shortest possible path. Secondary process, the mode of the conscious and the ego, characterized by logic, language, attention to reality, the ability to delay. It is the thinking of waking life, of problem solving, of planning. It seeks discharge along paths that are realistic and adaptive. Both are necessary. Primary process gives us access to creativity, intuition, the associative leaps that connect seemingly disparate ideas. Secondary process gives us the ability to function in the world, to communicate, to achieve long-term goals. The pathology lies not in the existence of primary process, but in its domination of the entire psyche, in the inability to shift between modes, in the rigid adherence to one at the exclusion of the other. And yet, even in the healthiest psyche, conflict persists, because the demands of the id are relentless, the constraints of reality are unyielding, and the superego, with its impossible standards, adds a third source of pressure. The ego, as Freud famously said, is not master in its own house. It is a servant to three harsh masters. And when it cannot satisfy all three, the result is anxiety. We must turn now to that anxiety, to the signal that the ego is overwhelmed, and to the defenses, the intricate, ingenious mechanisms the mind uses to protect itself from being flooded by unbearable affect. Anxiety is not one thing, it is many. There is the anxiety of the child alone in the dark, the anxiety of the student before an exam, the anxiety of the lover fearing rejection, the anxiety that arrives for no reason at all, a tightness in the chest, a racing heart, a sense of impending doom. Freud distinguished three types of anxiety: realistic anxiety, fear of an external danger, a threat that is real, immediate, proportionate. You see a snake, you feel fear. This is adaptive. It prepares you to flee or fight. Neurotic anxiety, fear of the id, Fear that your own impulses will overwhelm you, that you will lose control, that you will do something terrible or shameful. This is the anxiety of the person who fears they will say something inappropriate, or harm someone they love, or succumb to a desire they find intolerable. The danger is internal, but the fear is real. Moral anxiety, fear of the superego, guilt, the dread of punishment from the internal judge. Even when no action has been taken, the mere wish can trigger moral anxiety. The child who wishes the parent dead feels guilt as intense as if the deed were done, because the superego does not distinguish between thought and action. All three types can be overwhelming, and when anxiety becomes unbearable, the ego deploys defenses. These are unconscious strategies to protect the self from psychic pain. They operate automatically, outside awareness, and while they provide temporary relief, they often create problems of their own. Repression is the foundational defense, the pushing down of intolerable thoughts, memories, desires into the unconscious. It is motivated forgetting, the trauma you do not remember, the desire you do not recognize as your own. Repression protects you from being flooded by overwhelming affect, but what is repressed does not vanish. It continues to exert pressure, and it finds indirect expression in symptoms, in dreams, in slips, in behavior patterns you cannot explain. Denial is a refusal to acknowledge reality. A person receives a terminal diagnosis and acts as if nothing has changed. A partner is clearly unfaithful, but the betrayed spouse insists all is well. Denial is more primitive than repression. It does not push something into the unconscious. It simply refuses to let it register in consciousness at all. It is the psyche saying, "This is not happening. I do not see this. Reality is too painful, so I will rewrite it." Projection is the attribution of your own unacceptable impulses to someone else. You feel anger, but you cannot tolerate feeling angry, so you see others as angry at you. You feel desire, but you cannot admit it, so you accuse another person of desiring you. Projection is the foundation of paranoia. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting back what you cannot own in yourself. Displacement shifts emotion from its true target to a safer one. You are angry at your boss, but you cannot express it without risking your job. So you go home and snap at your spouse, yell at your child, kick the dog. The anger is real, but the target has been displaced. The energy finds discharge along a path that feels safer, even if the object is innocent. Rationalization constructs a socially acceptable reason for behavior that is actually driven by less acceptable motives. The student who fails an exam because they did not study says the test was unfair. The person who did not get a job promotion says they did not want it anyway. Rationalization preserves self-esteem. It allows you to maintain a positive self-image even when your behavior contradicts it. Regression is a return to earlier, more childlike modes of functioning. Under stress, an adult may become clingy, petulant, helpless. They seek comfort in ways that feel inappropriate for their age. Regression is an unconscious attempt to return to a time when you were cared for, when the world was simpler, when someone else was responsible. Reaction formation turns an unacceptable impulse into its opposite. You feel hatred, but express exaggerated love. You feel desire, but become puritanical and censorious. The defense is betrayed by its intensity. The hatred is so uncomfortable that it must be overcompensated with sweetness. The desire is so threatening that it must be drowned out by moral outrage. Reaction formation is the loud no that hides the quiet yes. Sublimation is the only defense Freud considered truly adaptive. It channels unacceptable impulses into socially valued activities. Aggression becomes competitive sport. Sexual energy becomes artistic creation. The drive is not repressed. It is transformed, redirected, given a form that is both satisfying and socially acceptable. Sublimation allows the id's energy to serve the ego's purposes. It is the alchemy by which base drives are turned into culture, art, science. But here is the paradox. Defenses are both necessary and costly. Necessary because without them the ego would be flooded, paralyzed by unbearable anxiety. Costly because they distort reality, consume energy, and prevent genuine resolution. Defenses keep you safe, but they also keep you stuck. Psychoanalysis does not aim to eliminate defenses. That would leave the ego defenseless, which is untenable. The aim is to make defenses more flexible, to help the person recognize when they are defending, what they are defending against, and whether the defense is still necessary. Sometimes the danger that once required a defense no longer exists. The parent who was critical is gone. The trauma is in the past. And yet the defense continues, automatically, creating problems where there is no longer a threat. To become aware of your defenses is to regain a measure of freedom. You can choose, consciously, how to respond. You can lower the defense in safe contexts. You can find more adaptive ways to manage anxiety. But this work cannot be done alone. It requires another person, someone who can witness, who can hold, who can tolerate what you cannot yet tolerate in yourself. It requires the therapeutic relationship. And that relationship, as Freud discovered, is not neutral. It is charged with meaning, with feeling, with projections that come from the past. We turn now to the role of the therapist and to the complex dynamics of transference and countertransference that make the therapeutic relationship both the vehicle of healing and the site of the deepest work. The analyst does not give advice, does not tell you what to do, does not judge, does not comfort in the ordinary sense. The analyst listens, reflects, interprets, waits. This was, in Freud's time, a radical departure. Physicians were authorities. They diagnosed, prescribed, directed. Patients were passive recipients of expert knowledge. But psychoanalysis inverted the power dynamic. The patient was the expert on their own mind. The analyst was merely a facilitator, a mirror, a presence. Freud sat behind the patient, out of sight. This was partly practical. He did not want to be stared at for hours each day. But it was also strategic. The analyst's face is a blank screen. If the patient cannot see the analyst's expressions, cannot read approval or disapproval, they are freer to project, to imagine. To experience the analyst not as a particular person, but as a stand-in for others, parents, lovers, authority figures from the past. This is crucial, because the therapeutic relationship is not just about insight. It is about experience. The patient will, inevitably, bring into the room the same patterns, the same conflicts, the same ways of relating that create problems in their life. They will see the analyst as they saw their father. They will expect criticism, or abandonment, or seduction, and when the analyst does not respond in the expected way, something shifts, a pattern is interrupted, a new possibility opens. But the analyst must remain neutral, not cold, not indifferent, but abstinent. The analyst does not meet the patient's demands for reassurance, for answers, for love. To do so would be to collude with the patient's defenses, to provide the gratification that allows the patient to avoid facing the deeper conflict. Freud called this the rule of abstinence. The patient must remain in a state of frustration, of unsatisfied longing, because it is precisely this frustration that brings the unconscious material to the surface. If the patient's needs are met, they have no reason to explore where those needs come from. If they are soothed, they will not examine why they need soothing. This sounds harsh, and it can feel harsh, but it is not punitive. It is a form of respect. The analyst trusts that the patient has the capacity to tolerate frustration, that they can bear not knowing, that they can sit with anxiety long enough to understand it. The analyst also maintains a frame. Sessions begin and end at the same time. They occur at the same frequency. The fee is consistent. The setting is stable. This predictability creates safety. It allows the patient to relax the defenses slightly, knowing that the ground will not shift beneath them. The frame holds the chaos of the unconscious. It says, "You can say anything, you can feel anything, and I will still be here." But within that frame, the analyst must also be human, not a robot, not a cipher. The analyst has feelings, thoughts, reactions, and these too are part of the work. Because just as the patient projects onto the analyst experiences counter-transference feelings and responses evoked by the patient. And these feelings, if examined, can be a window into what the patient is unconsciously communicating. We are nearing the heart of the therapeutic process, the place where past and present collapse into one another, where the patient's earliest relationships are restaged in the consulting room, where healing occurs not through insight alone, but through the lived experience of a different kind of relationship. Here is what happens. The patient comes to therapy with a problem, a symptom, a pattern they cannot break. But as the work progresses, something strange occurs. The patient begins to feel toward the analyst what they once felt toward someone else. They fall in love. They become angry. They feel abandoned when the session ends. They see the analyst as critical or neglectful or seductive, even when the analyst has done nothing to warrant these perceptions. This is transference, the redirection of feelings, desires, and expectations from past figures onto the analyst. The patient does not know they are doing it. It feels real. It feels current. But it is, in fact, a repetition. The past is leaking into the present, and the analyst becomes the screen onto which the patient projects their internal drama. Freud initially saw transference as a nuisance, an obstacle to the work. Patients would become so focused on their feelings for him that they could not focus on the deeper material. But then he realized, transference is not an obstacle. It is the work, because in transference the patient is not just talking about their past, they are enacting it, living it. And this gives the analyst direct access to the patient's internal world. A patient becomes furiously angry at the analyst for ending a session on time. On the surface, this seems irrational, but the analyst listens to the associations. The patient speaks of a mother who was always leaving, always busy, never available, and suddenly the anger makes sense. It is not about the session, it is about the mother. The patient has transferred onto the analyst the rage they could not express as a child. And now, in the safety of the therapeutic relationship, that rage can be explored, understood, and eventually integrated. Or a patient becomes erotically attached to the analyst, speaks of love, of longing, of fantasies, of being special. The analyst does not reciprocate, does not shame, does not gratify. Instead, the analyst asks, "Where does this feeling come from?" And the patient begins to remember. A father who was emotionally distant, a childhood spent trying to be the favorite, to win the love that felt just out of reach. The transference is not about the analyst, it is about the father. And the work is to see this, to grieve the love that was never sufficient, to stop seeking it in surrogates. Transference can be positive or negative. Positive transference, idealization, love, admiration. The patient sees the analyst as all-knowing, all-good, the perfect parent they never had. This feels good. But it is also a defense. If the analyst is perfect, the patient can remain dependent, can avoid facing their own agency, can stay a child. Negative transference, anger, suspicion, hostility. The patient sees the analyst as critical, manipulative, out to get them. This is harder to bear, but it is often more productive, because negative transference brings into the room the parts of the patient's experience that were most painful, the disappointments, the betrayals, the ways they were failed. And if the analyst can tolerate the patient's anger without retaliating or withdrawing, the patient learns that rage does not destroy, that the relationship can survive conflict. But transference is not one-sided. The analyst too has feelings, reactions. Countertransference is the analyst's emotional response to the patient. Sometimes it is a reaction to the patient's transference. The patient treats the analyst like a stern father, and the analyst feels an urge to be authoritative. Or the patient is seductive, and the analyst feels drawn in. Other times, countertransference reveals something about the analyst's own unresolved issues. A patient's neediness triggers the analyst's irritation, not because the patient is doing anything wrong, but because the analyst has their own discomfort with dependency. This is why analysts must undergo their own analysis, to clear the instrument, to ensure that their responses are in service of the patient, not a discharge of the analyst's own conflicts. But countertransference, when examined, is also a tool. If the analyst feels bored, perhaps the patient is defending against emotion by intellectualizing. If the analyst feels confused, perhaps the patient is enacting a childhood experience of chaos. If the analyst feels protective, perhaps the patient is evoking a vulnerability they cannot yet name. The analyst's feelings are data, a window into what is happening in the unconscious exchange between two people. Freud was cautious about countertransference. He worried that it could contaminate the work. But later analysts, especially those in the relational tradition, came to see it as central. The therapeutic relationship is not a one-way street. It is an intersubjective field. Both people are affected. Both people contribute. And the healing occurs not because the analyst is perfectly neutral, but because the analyst is willing to be affected, to recognize their responses, and to use them in service of the patient's growth. Transference and countertransference make therapy slow, difficult, intimate, uncomfortable, but they also make it powerful, because they allow the past to be brought into the present, not as a memory, but as a living experience, and in that experience something new can happen. The patient can be angry and not be punished, can need and not be abandoned, can express desire and not be shamed, and slowly, over time, the patient learns, I am not who I thought I was. The story I have been telling about myself, about being unlovable or dangerous or fundamentally flawed is not the whole truth. It is a story I internalized from old relationships, and it can be rewritten. This is the deepest work of psychoanalysis. Not insight, not catharsis, but the lived experience of a different kind of relationship, one that is consistent, attuned, non-judgmental, one that does not replicate the old wounds, but offers a space in which those wounds can be seen, felt, and mourned. And yet, as profound as the work of individual therapy can be, Freud did not stop there. He turned his gaze outward, from the consulting room to the world, from the individual psyche to the structures of civilization itself. He asked, what happens when the dynamics of repression, desire, and conflict are scaled up to the level of society? What does psychoanalysis reveal about culture, religion, art, and the very possibility of living together? We turn now to Freud's social and cultural theories, to the ways he applied his understanding of the individual mind to the collective mind, and to the dark, uncomfortable questions he asked about the price of civilization. Civilization promises us much: security, order, beauty, meaning, the comforts of language, art, law, technology. But civilization also demands much. It asks us to renounce our instincts, to defer gratification, to suppress aggression, to live according to rules that often contradict our desires. And so we are, all of us, living in a state of tension between what we want and what we are allowed, between our nature and our culture. This tension, Freud argued, is the source of what he called discontent, a malaise, a background hum of dissatisfaction that no amount of progress can entirely eliminate. Civilization and Its Discontents, published in 1930, is Freud's meditation on this predicament. It is a dark book, written in the shadow of World War I, on the eve of even greater catastrophe. It asks, why are we so unhappy? Why, despite all our achievements, do we suffer? And is happiness even possible for creatures like us? Freud's answer is uncomfortable. Civilization, he suggests, is built on repression, specifically the repression of two fundamental drives, sexuality and aggression. These drives are asocial. They do not care about the well-being of others. They seek satisfaction at any cost, and if left unchecked, they would make social life impossible. So civilization intervenes. It installs prohibitions. It channels libido into work, into family, into socially acceptable outlets. It punishes aggression. It demands that we control ourselves. But this control is not free. It comes at a cost. The energy that might have been discharged in direct satisfaction is now bound up in the service of repression. The individual becomes neurotic, anxious, guilty. The instincts do not disappear. They are merely forced underground, where they fester and mutate. The child, in the process of socialization, internalizes the prohibitions of the parents. This internalized authority becomes the superego, and the superego is harsh. It does not simply forbid certain actions. It forbids the wishes themselves. It punishes you for desiring what you are not allowed to have, and so you become your own jailer. The external authority is no longer needed. You police yourself. You feel guilt, even when you have done nothing wrong, because you know what you wanted to do, and the superego knows. This is the condition of civilized man, perpetually at war with himself. The id pushes, the superego condemns, the ego tries to mediate, and the result is a chronic, low-level unhappiness, a sense of something missing, a longing for a freedom that can never be reclaimed. But Freud does not counsel a return to nature. He is not a romantic. He knows that the state of nature is not paradise. It is violence, chaos, the war of all against all. Civilization, for all its discontents, is still better than the alternative. It protects us from each other. It makes art and science and love possible, but it does not make us happy. It makes us safe. These are not the same thing. One of the most powerful passages in the book concerns guilt. Freud argues that as civilization advances, as the superego becomes more demanding, guilt intensifies. The more civilized we become, the more we suffer from a sense of unworthiness. Because the superego's standards are impossible, it demands not just that you refrain from bad actions, but that you be good, that you be selfless, that you renounce your desires entirely. And since you cannot do this, since you are still human, still driven by the id, you feel perpetually guilty. This is the paradox of moral progress. The better we try to be, the worse we feel. The more we achieve, the more aware we are of falling short. Civilization does not cure us of guilt. It deepens it. And then there is aggression. Freud came to see aggression as one of the primary instincts, equal in force to the sexual instinct. Human beings are not naturally peaceful. We are capable of extraordinary cruelty. We destroy. We dominate. We take pleasure in the suffering of others. Civilization tries to tame this aggression. It redirects it inward as guilt. It sublimates it into competition, into sport, into art. But it cannot eliminate it. This is why war keeps returning, why revolutions devour their own children, why utopian visions so often collapse into tyranny. Because the aggression is always there, beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. And when the social bonds weaken, when the prohibitions loosen, the violence erupts. Freud did not offer solutions. He was not an optimist. He believed that the conflict between instinct and civilization is irresolvable, that we are caught in a tragic bind. We need civilization to survive. But civilization makes us miserable, and there is no escape. And yet, even in this darkness, Freud found value in the ability to see clearly, to face the truth without illusion, to accept the limits of what is possible. This is not despair, it is maturity. The recognition that life is difficult, that suffering is inevitable, and that the best we can do is to live with awareness, with courage, with as much honesty as we can bear. And if civilization is built on repression, then culture is built on sublimation. The art, the science, the beauty we create, these are not escapes from instinct. They are transformations of instinct. They are the ways we turn the base metal of drive into the gold of meaning. But before we turn to art and sublimation, we must confront the darkest of Freud's late theories, the one that even he found disturbing. The idea that alongside the drive toward life, toward connection, toward pleasure, there is another drive, a drive toward death, toward dissolution, toward a return to the inorganic state. We turn now to the death drive. Freud spent most of his career elaborating the life instincts, eros, the drives toward pleasure, connection, growth, reproduction. These are the forces that bind, that build, that create. They are the reason we seek others, fall in love, form communities. They are life-affirming, constructive. But in 1920, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud proposed something darker. He observed that people do not only seek pleasure, they also repeat painful experiences. Veterans of war dream again and again of the trauma. Children play games that reenact their own surgeries. Patients return compulsively to the same destructive relationships. Why would the psyche do this? Why would it return to pain? Freud's answer: because there is another instinct, one that does not seek pleasure, but seeks an earlier state, a state before tension, before excitation, before life itself, the death drive. Thanatos, the pull toward quiescence, toward silence, toward the dissolution of the self. The death drive is not a wish to die in the conscious sense. It is an organismic tendency toward entropy, toward the reduction of all tension to zero. Life is tension. Life is excitation. The death drive is the opposite. It is the return to the inorganic, to the stillness that preceded existence. This is, by any measure, a speculative theory. Freud himself was uncertain. He called it a mythology, a conceptual scaffold that might or might not correspond to biological reality. But he found it clinically useful. It explained phenomena that the life instincts alone could not. One of these phenomena is aggression. If there is a drive toward death, and if this drive cannot be turned fully inward because that would mean suicide, then it must be turned outward, toward others. And this is the root of human aggression. Not just a response to frustration, not just a tool for achieving goals, but an instinct, a drive toward destruction, as fundamental as the drive toward creation. This is a bleak vision. It suggests that violence is not an aberration. It is part of our nature, that no amount of education or enlightenment will eliminate it, that civilization can only ever manage aggression, redirect it, sublimate it, but it cannot erase it. Freud pointed to history as evidence: war, genocide, torture, the mob violence that erupts when social bonds break, the pleasure people take in cruelty. These are not anomalies. They are expressions of a drive that exists in all of us, repressed most of the time, channeled into acceptable forms, but always there, waiting. And the death drive also turns inward, as the superego, as guilt, as the harsh, punitive voice that condemns the self. The superego, Freud came to believe, is fueled by the death drive. It is aggression turned back against the ego. And this is why guilt can be so intense, so relentless, so impervious to reason, because it is not rational. It is the death drive finding a target within. This late theory troubled many of Freud's followers. Some rejected it outright. Others tried to soften it, to integrate it with less pessimistic frameworks. But Freud held to it. He believed he had seen something real, that there is in human beings a pull toward destruction, toward the undoing of everything that has been built, toward the silence that follows the end. But Freud was not advocating for nihilism. He was advocating for clear sight, for the recognition that we are not as rational, as peaceful, as good as we like to believe, that within us is a darkness, and that if we do not acknowledge it, it will control us. If we deny the death drive, it will erupt in violence. If we deny our aggression, it will poison us from within as guilt. The therapeutic task, then, is not to eliminate these drives. That is impossible. It is to bring them into consciousness, to see them, to acknowledge them, and to find ways to channel them that are less destructive. This is sublimation, this is art, this is the work of culture. And yet, even as Freud wrote of death, he continued to live, to work, to create. He faced his own death, cancer of the jaw, decades of surgeries, chronic pain with stoic courage. He did not turn away. He looked directly at what was coming, and he wrote, "This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Freud's late work, that to live fully you must face the darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to see it, to know it, and to choose, in the face of it, to build something, to love, to make meaning, to persist. And part of that meaning-making involves confronting the structures that shape our collective lives, religion, art, the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from and where we are going." Freud turned his psychoanalytic lens on these domains as well, and what he found, as always, was both illuminating and unsettling. We turn now to Freud's analysis of religion, to the illusion he believed sustains civilization even as it infantilizes its adherents. Freud did not believe in God. He said so clearly, repeatedly, without apology. But he was deeply interested in why others do. Why, despite the progress of science, despite the evidence of suffering and injustice, do so many people continue to believe? What need does religion fulfill? What function does it serve? His answer? Religion is a collective neurosis, a shared illusion born from the same psychic mechanisms that produce individual neurosis. Specifically, it is a defense against helplessness, against the terror of existence, against the unbearable recognition that we are small, mortal, alone in an indifferent universe. The child, Freud observed, is helpless, dependent on parents for survival, and the parents, especially the father, loom as powerful protective figures. The father can ward off danger, can provide, can punish. The child both loves and fears the father, and this ambivalence, this mixture of longing and dread, shapes the child's internal world. Religion, Freud argued, is a projection of this infantile dynamic onto the cosmos. God is the exalted Father, all-powerful, all-knowing, benevolent, if stern. He watches over you, protects you, judges you, and in return you must obey, must worship, must submit. This projection serves a purpose. It transforms a hostile, random universe into a meaningful one. If there is a God, then suffering has a reason. If there is a divine plan, then your life matters. If there is a Father in heaven, then you are not alone. The anxiety of existence is managed by the fantasy of a cosmic parent who cares. But this is, for Freud, an illusion, not in the sense that it is consciously false believers genuinely believe, but in the sense that it is wish fulfillment. You believe because you need to believe, because the alternative is too frightening. Religion consoles, but it does not correspond to reality. It is a dream from which humanity, Freud hoped, would eventually awaken. In The Future of an Illusion, published in 1927, Freud argued that religion is incompatible with the scientific worldview. Science demands evidence, reason, the willingness to revise beliefs in light of new data. Religion demands faith, obedience, the acceptance of dogma, and as science advances, as we learn more about the natural world, the explanatory power of religion diminishes. What once required a god to explain thunder, disease, the motion of planets can now be explained by natural laws. But Freud recognized that religion does not persist merely because of its explanatory power. It persists because of its emotional power. It offers meaning, community, ritual, a sense of belonging. And it offers the promise that death is not the end, that suffering will be redeemed, that the good will be rewarded, and the wicked punished. These are powerful consolations, and Freud did not mock those who need them. He understood the appeal. He himself had once been tempted, in moments of despair, to believe, but he resisted, because he believed that intellectual honesty demanded it, that to face reality without illusion, however painful, was the mark of maturity. And yet, Freud also worried. What would happen if religion disappeared? Would people be able to bear the loss? Would they find other sources of meaning? Or would they collapse into nihilism, into violence, into despair? He did not know. He hoped that reason and science could provide a foundation for ethics, for community, for a life worth living. But he was not certain. Freud's critique of religion has been accused of reductionism, of dismissing the genuine spiritual experiences of millions, of ignoring the ways religion has inspired art, kindness, justice. And there is truth in these criticisms. Freud's lens was narrow. He saw religion through the framework of psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis is fundamentally about conflict, repression, and illusion. But what he offered was not dismissal, it was analysis, an invitation to ask, why do I believe what I believe? What need is this belief serving? And is there a way to meet that need without sacrificing truth? These are not comfortable questions. But Freud never promised comfort. He promised clarity, the chance to see yourself and your culture with honest eyes. And if religion is a collective defense against helplessness, then art is a collective expression of sublimated desire, a transformation of the forbidden into the beautiful, a way to give form to what cannot be spoken directly. We turn now to art and sublimation, to the ways Freud understood creativity as both a symptom and a cure. The artist, Freud believed, is someone who cannot find satisfaction in reality, who feels estranged from the world, uncomfortable in their own skin, who longs for beauty, for power, for love, but cannot attain them through ordinary means. And so the artist turns away from reality, retreats into fantasy, and creates. But the artist is not simply escaping. The artist is sublimating, taking the raw, unacceptable drives, the aggression, the sexual curiosity, the narcissistic grandiosity, and transforming them into something socially valued, a painting, a novel, a symphony. The drive is not repressed, it is redirected, and in its new form, it gives pleasure not only to the artist, but to others. Sublimation is the alchemy of the psyche. It is the process by which base desires are turned into gold, and it is, for Freud, the most adaptive of all the defense mechanisms, because it satisfies the drive while also serving the culture. It allows the individual to express what they must express, without guilt, without conflict, and it enriches the world. Freud analyzed the lives and works of several artists: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare. He looked for clues in their childhoods, for the conflicts and traumas that might have fueled their creativity. He believed that art, like dreams, like symptoms, is overdetermined, that every work contains multiple layers of meaning, that to understand it, you must trace it back to the unconscious wishes it expresses. Consider Leonardo. Freud noted his fascination with androgynous figures, his unfinished projects, his secretive nature. Freud speculated controversially that Leonardo's art was shaped by a childhood memory of a bird's tail touching his lips while he lay in his cradle. Freud interpreted this memory as a fantasy, a coded expression of oral eroticism and a wish for the mother. Whether or not this specific interpretation is accurate, the method is revealing. Freud believed that great art is born from unresolved conflict, that the artist creates in order to master what they cannot master in life. Art, then, is a kind of play, a return to primary process thinking. In the act of creation, the artist suspends the reality principle. Logic loosens, time collapses. The boundaries between self and other blur. This is why art feels magical, why it can evoke feelings that ordinary life cannot, because it gives voice to the unconscious. It speaks the language of dreams. But art is not only for the artist, it is for the audience. And the audience, too, experiences a kind of sublimation. Watching a tragedy, we discharge feelings of pity and terror that we carry but cannot express. Reading a novel, we live lives we will never live. Listening to music, we feel emotions we cannot name. Art allows us to experience forbidden wishes vicariously, safely, without guilt. This is the social function of art. It is a shared dream, a collective expression of what we all feel but cannot say. It binds the community. It says, "You are not alone. Others feel this too." And it transforms suffering into beauty, pain into meaning, chaos into form. Freud did not romanticize artists. He saw them as neurotics, fundamentally, driven by the same conflicts that drive patients into therapy. But he also saw them as fortunate, because they found a way to channel their conflicts into creation. They gave shape to their suffering, and in doing so, they transcended it. But sublimation is not available to everyone. Not everyone has the talent, the training, the opportunity to create. And so most people must find other ways to manage their drives: work, hobbies, love, family. These, too, are forms of sublimation, not as celebrated as art, but no less important. They are the ways ordinary people make their lives bearable, meaningful, worth living. And yet, Freud also warned, sublimation is not enough. It is a solution, but not a complete one, because the drives are relentless. They demand more than culture can give. And so we are left with discontent, with the sense that something is missing, that we are exiled from a home we can never return to. This is the human condition, to create, to yearn, to never quite arrive. But dreams, Freud insisted, offer more than just symbolic expression. They offer a nightly reminder that the unconscious is always at work, that beneath the surface of waking life, another life continues, a life of wishes, fears, and unfinished business. We return now to dreams, not as the royal road we first traveled, but as a deeper exploration of their therapeutic and existential significance. You have dreamed every night of your life. Thousands of dreams, tens of thousands. Most are forgotten within minutes of waking. A few linger, strange and vivid, like messages in a language you almost understand. And a handful, perhaps only a handful, stay with you for years. Dreams that feel important, though you cannot say why. Dreams that seem to be trying to tell you something. Freud's theory of dreams was revolutionary, but it was also clinical. Dreams, in his framework, were primarily diagnostic tools, windows into the unconscious conflicts that drive neurosis. And the work of interpretation was to decode the dream, to extract the latent content, to make the unconscious conscious. But dreams are more than symptoms. They are also experiences, nightly journeys into a world that operates by different rules. A world where the dead speak, where time runs backward, where you can fly or drown or transform into someone else. Dreams are not just messages, they are events, and they have a significance that exceeds their utility in therapy. Consider the dream of flying. You lift off the ground. The sensation is exhilarating. You soar above landscapes that shift and change. There is no fear, only freedom. When you wake, the feeling lingers, a sense of possibility, of transcendence, of having touched something larger than your ordinary self. Freud might interpret this dream as a symbolic expression of a wish, perhaps a sexual wish flying as metaphor for erection, or a grandiose wish, the fantasy of rising above limitations, of being special, superior. And these interpretations might be correct, but they do not exhaust the dream's meaning. Because the dream is also an experience of freedom, a momentary liberation from the constraints of the body, of gravity, of the reality principle, and that experience has value in itself. Dreams remind us that the psyche is larger than consciousness, that there are parts of us that do not obey the rules we live by during the day, parts that are wild, creative, terrifying, beautiful. Dreams give those parts a stage. And even if we do not interpret them, even if we do not analyze them, they enrich our inner lives simply by occurring. Some dreams are terrifying, nightmares in which you are chased, attacked, paralyzed. You cannot move. You try to scream, but no sound comes. You wake in terror, heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. Freud saw nightmares as failed wish fulfillments, dreams in which the repressed material broke through too forcefully, overwhelming the dream work's ability to disguise it. The wish is there, but it is so unacceptable that even the dream cannot contain it. And so the dream becomes a nightmare. But nightmares also serve a function. They rehearse danger. They prepare us for threat. They let us experience the worst without actual consequence. A child who dreams of losing her parents is processing separation anxiety. An adult who dreams of public humiliation is confronting shame. The nightmare is the psyche's way of facing what it fears, of mastering, through repetition, what cannot be mastered in waking life. And then there are the dreams that predict, not literally. Freud did not believe in precognition, but dreams can anticipate, can sense patterns before the conscious mind does. You dream that a friendship is ending, and weeks later it does, not because the dream caused it, but because your unconscious already noticed the signs, the subtle withdrawals, the unspoken tensions. The dream was the first to name what you were not yet ready to consciously acknowledge. Dreams also heal. In the midst of grief, you dream of the person you lost. You speak to them, hold them, and when you wake, the grief is somehow lighter. The dream gave you what reality cannot. One more moment, one more conversation, a chance to say what you did not say. The dream is compensation, the psyche's attempt to balance what has been lost. Freud knew this. Even as he insisted on interpretation, on analysis, on the extraction of meaning, he also valued the dream as experience, as a nightly reminder that we are more than our conscious selves, that we contain multitudes, that the life of the mind is vast, strange, inexhaustible. And so dreams, beyond therapy, are a form of poetry, a nightly performance of the soul's theater. They do not always need to be understood. Sometimes they simply need to be witnessed, remembered, honored. But if dreams offer a window into the individual unconscious, Then case studies offer a window into the method, into the actual practice of psychoanalysis, into the messy, complex, sometimes failed attempts to bring healing through understanding. We turn now to three of Freud's most famous cases, three individuals whose suffering became the basis for theory, whose stories, however imperfectly told, reveal both the power and the limits of the psychoanalytic method. Dora was 18 when she came to Freud, or rather, when her father brought her. She had developed a constellation of symptoms: difficulty breathing, nervous cough, loss of voice, depression, threats of suicide. Her father was desperate, and Freud, confident in his method, believed he could cure her. Dora's real name was Ida Bauer. Freud disguised her identity, but only barely. Her story was this: her father was having an affair with a woman, Frau K., and the woman's husband, Herr K., had made sexual advances toward Dora. Dora had rejected him, but her father did not believe her. Or rather, he wanted her to accept Herr K.'s attentions so that he could continue his affair with Frau K. undisturbed. Freud's interpretation: Dora was unconsciously attracted to Herr K. Her symptoms were expressions of repressed desire. Her difficulty breathing, her cough, these were symbolic. Oral symptoms suggesting oral wishes. Her rejection of Herr K. was a defense. She wanted him but could not admit it. And beneath that, Freud believed, was an even deeper attraction to Frau K. herself, a homoerotic desire that Dora found intolerable. Freud was certain of his interpretation. He pressed it upon Dora, insisted that she accept it, but Dora resisted. She became angry, and after 11 weeks, she abruptly terminated the treatment. She walked out, and Freud was left bewildered, defensive, somewhat humiliated. Later commentators have pointed out what Freud could not see: that Dora was in an impossible situation, that she was being used as a pawn in the adult's sexual games, that her father was betraying her, that Herr K.'s advances were not flattering, they were a violation, that her anger was justified, that she was not repressing desire, she was expressing truth. And Freud, aligned with her father, with the patriarchal order, dismissed her reality in favor of his theory. The case of Dora is a cautionary tale, a reminder that interpretation can be a form of violence, that the analyst's certainty can silence the patient's voice, that power matters, that gender matters, that theory, however brilliant, must be held lightly, or it becomes tyranny. But Freud learned from his mistakes, or tried to. He acknowledged later that he had failed to recognize the transference, that Dora had transferred onto him her rage at her father and at the men who had betrayed her, and when he aligned himself with those men, he replayed the trauma rather than healing it. The Rat Man was a young lawyer who came to Freud in 1907. His real name was Ernst Lanzer. He was tormented by obsessive thought, specifically a fantasy that a torture involving rats would be inflicted on people he loved, his father and the woman he was courting. The thought horrified him. He could not rid himself of it. It intruded constantly, unbidden. Freud traced this obsession to conflicting feelings about the father. The Rat Man loved his father, but he had also as a child felt rage toward him. The father had punished him for masturbating, and the Rat Man, unconsciously, had wished for his father's death. When the father actually died, the Rat Man was overcome with guilt. The obsessive thoughts were a punishment, a way of atoning for the forbidden wish. But there was more. The rat fantasy was also sexual. rats entering the anus, a reversal of Freud's own theory that anal eroticism is a component of childhood sexuality. The rat man was both expressing and punishing his own sexual desires, desires that violated his moral code. Freud worked with the rat man for nearly a year. The treatment was considered a success. The obsessions diminished. The rat man was able to function. He married. He resumed his career. But years later, during World War I, he was killed in battle. Freud never saw him again. The case of the rat man demonstrates Freud's method at its best. The patient was intelligent, introspective, willing to engage with the process. The interpretation was not forced. It emerged gradually, through free association, through dreams, through the patient's own realizations, and the relief came not from the elimination of the conflict, but from understanding it, from seeing how the past was controlling the present, from gaining, through awareness, a measure of freedom. The Wolfman was perhaps Freud's most famous case. His real name was Sergei Pankajev, a Russian aristocrat who came to Freud in 1910 suffering from severe neurosis. He was paralyzed by ambivalence, unable to function, dependent on others to manage even the simplest tasks. The case hinged on a dream, a childhood dream that the Wolfman had at age 4. In the dream he saw 6 or 7 white wolves sitting in a tree outside his window. They stared at him. He was terrified. He woke screaming. Freud spent months analyzing this dream, and he constructed an elaborate interpretation. The wolves, he proposed, were a reversal. The dream disguised a memory. The child had witnessed, at 18 months, his parents having intercourse. He had seen them from behind, in a position that revealed the mother's genitals and the father's penetration. The sight was overwhelming. It awakened sexual curiosity and castration anxiety. The wolves, still, staring, were the opposite of the primal scene's violent motion. White wolves, the opposite of the father's dark clothing. Many wolves, the opposite of the single overwhelming figure of the father. This interpretation has been endlessly debated. Is it brilliant or absurd? Did the memory exist, or did Freud create it through suggestion? The Wolfman himself, in later interviews, was ambiguous. Sometimes he confirmed Freud's account. Other times he expressed doubt. What is clear is this: the treatment was long, difficult, and only partially successful. The Wolfman's symptoms improved, but they returned. He required further therapy with other analysts for the rest of his life. He lived into old age, perpetually in treatment, perpetually the Wolfman. His identity became inseparable from his case history. The 3 cases reveal the promise and the peril of psychoanalysis. When it works, it offers profound insight, a way to trace the hidden connections between past and present, to name what has been nameless, to integrate what has been split off. But when it fails, it can impose meaning rather than discover it, can replicate trauma rather than heal it, can turn the patient into a case, a theory, an object of study rather than a subject with agency. Freud himself was aware of these dangers. He wrote about them. He acknowledged the limits of his knowledge. But he also believed that the attempt was worth making, that even an imperfect understanding is better than no understanding at all, that the darkness of the unconscious must be met with the light of consciousness, however dim, however uncertain that light may be. And yet, even as Freud developed his clinical practice, he continued to write about the larger questions, about the structures of belief that shape societies. About the illusions we cling to and the realities we deny, he returned again and again to the question of religion, to what it promises and what it costs. If religion is an illusion, what replaces it? This is the question Freud grappled with in The Future of an Illusion. He had criticized religion. He had called it a collective neurosis, a projection of infantile wishes onto the cosmos. But he was not naive. He knew that religion served functions that were not easily replaced. It provided comfort, community, moral structure, a sense that life has purpose. But Freud believed that humanity could and must outgrow these consolations, that the price of illusion is too high, that to believe in comforting falsehoods is to remain infantile, and that maturity requires facing reality without the crutch of divine reassurance. What would this maturity look like? Freud proposed reason, science, education, a culture built not on faith but on evidence, not on obedience to divine authority, but on rational deliberation and ethical principles derived from human needs and social cooperation. He acknowledged the difficulty, that most people are not rational, that they are driven by emotion, by need, by the desire for security. That to strip away the illusion of God is to leave them exposed to the terror of existence, the indifference of the universe, the finality of death, the absence of ultimate meaning. But Freud believed that this terror could be borne, that humans are capable of more courage than we give them credit for, that we can find meaning without invoking the supernatural, that we can be good without fear of divine punishment, that we can face death without the promise of an afterlife. This is a Stoic vision, a kind of secular religion of reason, and it is, in its way, beautiful. The idea that we can stand upright in a godless universe, that we can create our own values, that we can love and work and build, knowing that it will all end in dust, that we can do this simply because it is worth doing, because we are here, because we are human. But Freud's vision was also criticized by believers, obviously, who saw it as arrogant, as reductive, as dismissive of experiences that reason cannot explain, but also by fellow psychoanalysts, by those who believed that religion meets psychological needs that reason cannot meet, that the sacred, the transcendent, the numinous, these are real dimensions of human experience, and that to dismiss them as illusion is to impoverish the psyche. Freud did not change his mind. He remained, to the end, a rationalist, an atheist, a scientist, but he also remained curious, respectful, in his way, of the depth of religious feeling, even as he rejected its claims. And he turned his attention to another domain of illusion, the illusions we have about ourselves, about the coherence of the self, about the stability of identity, about what it means to say, I. We turn now to narcissism, to Freud's exploration of self-love, self-regard, and the fragility of the ego. Narcissus, in the myth, fell in love with his own reflection. He stared into the pool, unable to look away, and wasted away from longing for what he could never possess. His story became a warning about self-absorption, about vanity, about the dangers of loving only oneself. But Freud saw narcissism differently, not as a moral failing, but as a developmental stage, and, in some forms, as a necessary component of psychological health. Primary narcissism is the state of the infant. The infant does not yet distinguish self from world. Everything is part of the self. The breast is me. The mother is me. There is no other. only the oceanic feeling of unity. This is not pathology, it is the starting point, the original state before the painful process of separation begins. As the child grows, this primary narcissism must be given up. The child learns that the mother is separate, that the world does not revolve around them, that they are small, dependent, not omnipotent. This is a wound, a narcissistic injury, the loss of the fantasy of completeness. But the child compensates. They redirect the libido that was invested in the self toward external objects. They form attachments to parents, to friends, to lovers. This is object love, the ability to care about others, to invest in relationships, to find satisfaction not only in one's own pleasure, but in the pleasure of the beloved. Yet some portion of narcissism always remains. We never fully give up the wish to be special, to be admired, to be the center of someone's world, and this is not necessarily bad. A healthy narcissism is self-respect, self-care, the ability to take pride in one's accomplishments, to defend one's boundaries, to say, "I matter." But narcissism can also be pathological. When the narcissistic wound is too deep, when the child's sense of worth is too fragile, they may retreat from object love back into narcissism. They create a grandiose self-image, a fantasy of perfection. They demand constant admiration. They cannot tolerate criticism. They lack empathy, because to truly see another person would mean confronting their own inadequacy. Freud saw this as a defense, a way of protecting a fragile ego from collapse. The narcissist is not truly in love with themselves. They are desperately trying to shore up a sense of self that feels perpetually under threat. They are, beneath the grandiosity, terrified of being worthless. This understanding shifted psychoanalytic practice. Earlier, Freud had focused on neurosis, on patients capable of forming relationships, capable of love, but tormented by conflict. But what about patients who could not form relationships, who could not love, who remained locked in narcissistic isolation? These patients required a different approach. The analyst could not rely on transference in the usual sense because the narcissistic patient does not form attachments. They see others, including the analyst, as extensions of themselves, as mirrors, as sources of validation. The analyst is not a person. They are a function. The therapeutic task, then, is to slowly, gently help the patient develop the capacity for object love, to see the analyst as separate, to tolerate the frustration of not being perfectly understood, to risk the vulnerability of needing another person. This is delicate work. The narcissistic patient is easily wounded, easily enraged. Any interpretation that threatens their grandiose self-image will be met with denial, with defensiveness, with a break in the relationship, and so the analyst must proceed carefully, must offer understanding before challenge, must build a foundation of trust strong enough to support the eventual confrontation with reality. Freud's work on narcissism influenced later thinkers Kohut, Kernberg, others who developed entire theories of narcissistic pathology and its treatment. But Freud's basic insight remains that the self is not a given, it is constructed, and it is fragile, that the coherent I is an achievement maintained through constant effort, and that when that achievement fails, when the self fragments or inflates, the result is profound suffering. But there are moments when even the healthy self feels strange, when you see yourself from outside, when you encounter your double, when the familiar becomes uncanny. And Freud, always drawn to the marginal, the unsettling, explored this experience as well. Have you ever walked into a place you have never been and felt that you have been there before? Have you ever looked in the mirror and for just a moment not recognized the face looking back? Have you ever encountered a stranger who resembles someone you know so perfectly that you are momentarily confused? This is the uncanny. In German, das Unheimlich, literally, the unhomely, the sense that something familiar has become strange, or something strange has become too familiar, a feeling of eerie recognition, of doubling, of being in two places at once. Freud wrote an essay on the uncanny in 1919. It was sparked by a story by E.T.A. Hoffmann, the Sandman, about a man who falls in love with an automaton, a mechanical woman who seems alive but is not. The story evoked a deep unease, and Freud wanted to understand why. His analysis traced the uncanny back to repressed material, things that were once familiar, childhood fears, early desires, magical thinking become repressed as we grow up. We learn to think rationally, to distinguish fantasy from reality, but the repressed material does not disappear, and when something in the external world resembles it, when it is triggered, we experience the uncanny. The repressed returns not as a memory, but as a feeling, a sense of dread, of wrongness. The double is one of the primary sources of the uncanny, seeing your doppelganger, encountering someone who looks exactly like you. In folklore, this is an omen of death. In psychology, it is a confrontation with the split in the self. The double is both you and not you. It represents the parts of yourself you have disowned, the shadow self. And to encounter it is to be reminded that you are not unified, that there is another within you. Freud also noted that the uncanny arises from the animistic worldview of childhood. As children, we believe that thoughts can cause events, that wishing can make things happen, that objects have intentions. This is magical thinking, and we are supposed to outgrow it, but we never fully do. Deep down, we still half believe. And so when something occurs that resembles this magical causality, a coincidence that feels too perfect, a wish that seems to come true, we feel the uncanny, a shiver, a sense that the boundaries between inner and outer, between mind and world, have dissolved. The uncanny is also evoked by certain objects, dolls, mannequins, wax figures, anything that looks human but is not quite. This is the realm of the almost alive, and it disturbs us because it blurs the line between living and dead, between subject and object. We project life into the inanimate, and then recoil when it does not fully reciprocate. Freud's essay on the uncanny is strange, digressive, less systematic than his other work, but it captures something essential about his sensibility, his fascination with the margins of experience, with the moments when rationality fails, when the repressed breaks through, when the unconscious makes itself felt not as symptom but as atmosphere, as mood, as the eerie recognition that the world is stranger than we pretend, and the uncanny is always waiting. In the déjà vu, in the dream that seems prophetic, in the sense that you are being watched when no one is there, in the feeling, late at night, that you are not alone in your own mind. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Freud's work, his theories about women, about femininity, about the so-called problem of female development. These theories have been rightly criticized, rightly challenged, but they must be confronted, because they reveal the limits of Freud's vision, and because they have shaped and distorted psychoanalytic thinking about gender for a century. Freud admitted late in his career that the question of femininity was a mystery to him. "What does a woman want?" he asked, and he never found a satisfying answer. His theories of female development were sketchy, contradictory, often openly confusing, and they were, by any contemporary standard, deeply problematic. The core of Freud's theory, the girl's psychological development, is defined by lack, by the discovery, in the phallic stage, that she does not have a penis. This discovery, Freud believed, is traumatic. The girl feels castrated, inferior. She blames the mother for this lack, and she turns toward the father, hoping to receive from him what she does not have. This is penis envy, not a metaphor. Freud meant it literally. He believed that girls envy boys for their anatomical difference, and that this envy shapes the girl's entire subsequent development. Her wish for a penis is later transformed into a wish for a baby. Motherhood becomes a compensation for the original lack. By any measure, this is crude, reductive, insulting. It defines women entirely in relation to men. It assumes that anatomy is destiny, that having a penis is inherently superior, and that women spend their lives mourning its absence. It ignores the reality of female embodiment, female desire, female subjectivity. And yet, if we step back from the literalism, if we ask what Freud might have been gesturing towards, something more interesting emerges. Perhaps penis envy is not about the penis at all. Perhaps it is about power, about the privileges accorded to men in a patriarchal society, about the girl's recognition that boys have access to a world of freedom, of agency, of authority that she is denied. In this reading, penis envy is social, not biological. It is the girl's awareness that she is, in her culture, considered less valuable, that her body is scrutinized and controlled, that her voice carries less weight, that her desires are dismissed or pathologized. The penis is a symbol of male privilege, and the girl's envy is not of an organ, but of the power that organ represents. But Freud did not make this leap. He remained trapped in biologism, in the assumption that psychological differences between men and women are rooted in anatomical differences, that women are passive where men are active, that women are narcissistic where men are object-oriented, that women's superegos are weaker, their sense of justice less developed, because they do not experience the same castration anxiety that forces boys to internalize paternal authority. These claims are not only offensive, they are empirically wrong, and they have been challenged by generations of feminist psychoanalysts, Horney, Klein, Mitchell, Benjamin, and many others who have shown that female development is not defined by lack, but by its own positive trajectory, that women's relationships to their bodies, to their mothers, to desire, are complex and varied, not reducible to envy of the masculine. Freud's failure on this front is not trivial. It shaped clinical practice for decades. Women who did not conform to his model were labeled as pathological, as refusing femininity. As clinging to masculinity complex, their anger was interpreted as penis envy, their ambition as unwomanly, their resistance to subordination as neurosis. But Freud also, paradoxically, opened doors by insisting that sexuality begins in childhood, by recognizing that women have desires, even if he often misunderstood those desires, by treating women as subjects whose inner lives mattered. He was a man of his time. He held the prejudices of his time, but he also pushed against some of them, and he created a framework that others could use to challenge his own assumptions. The lesson here is complex. Freud was brilliant, but he was not infallible. His insights into repression, into the unconscious, into the structure of conflict, these remain powerful. But his specific theories about women, about gender, about sexuality must be critically examined, must be revised, must be integrated with perspectives he did not have, could not have, from his position of male privilege in late 19th century Vienna. This is the ongoing work of psychoanalysis: to preserve what is valuable, to discard what is not, to remain open to critique, to evolve. And part of that evolution involves recognizing that psychoanalysis is not just a clinical practice. It is a social theory, a lens for understanding not only individuals, but cultures, institutions, power structures, the ways that unconscious dynamics shape collective life. Freud did not stop at the individual. He extended his insights to groups, to societies, to the structures of power and meaning that organize collective life. He asked, if individuals have an unconscious, do groups? If repression shapes personal psychology, does it also shape social psychology? His answers were speculative, ambitious, often controversial, but they opened a field, the psychoanalytic study of culture. In Totem and Taboo, published in 1913, Freud proposed a theory of the origins of civilization. He imagined a primal horde, a group of humans living under the tyranny of a violent father who hoarded all the women. The sons, filled with rage and desire, eventually banded together. They killed the father, and they devoured him. But then came guilt. The sons had loved the father even as they hated him, and so they instituted a taboo. No one could take the father's place. The women of the tribe would be off limits. This was the origin of the incest taboo, the foundation of kinship structures, the beginning of law. The murdered father, Freud suggested, became the totem, the sacred animal or object that the tribe worshipped. The totem was both a symbol of the father and a substitute for him. And the rituals surrounding the totem sacrifices, feasts, were reenactments of the original patricide. The group compulsively repeated the crime in disguised form. This story has been thoroughly debunked as anthropology. There is no evidence of a primal horde, no evidence of a historical patricide. But as myth, as metaphor, it remains provocative. Freud was asking, what is the psychological foundation of society? What binds us together? And his answer was guilt. Shared guilt over a shared crime. The recognition that we are capable of terrible violence, and the need to collectively defend against that violence through law, taboo, and ritual. Freud also analyzed mass movements. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, he explored how individuals, when part of a crowd, lose their individuality, they regress. They become suggestible, impulsive, capable of acts they would never commit alone. Why? Because the group provides a substitute for the ego ideal. The leader of the group, the dictator, the demagogue, the charismatic figure becomes the object of identification. Each member of the group projects onto the leader their idealized self, and in doing so, they surrender their own judgment, their own morality, to the collective. This is the psychology of fascism, of cults, of mob violence. The leader is the father, and the group is the primal horde, united in submission and in the shared fantasy that the leader will protect them, will give them identity, will make them powerful. Freud wrote this in 1921, before the rise of Hitler, before Stalin, but his insights were prophetic. He understood that the rational veneer of civilization is thin, that beneath it ancient dynamics persist, that the longing for a strong father, for certainty, for belonging, can override reason, can lead entire societies into atrocity. And he understood that this is not an aberration. It is a possibility inherent in human psychology. We are social creatures. We need to belong. But our need for belonging can be exploited, can be weaponized, can be turned against the very values, compassion, justice, truth, that civilization claims to uphold. Psychoanalysis, then, is not only about curing individuals. It is about understanding the unconscious forces that shape history, that drive war, that create scapegoats, that lead us to repeat, over and over, the same tragic patterns. And the question Freud left us with is this: can we become conscious enough as individuals and as societies to break those patterns, or are we doomed to repeat them? This is not a question with an easy answer, but it is a question worth asking. And Freud's legacy, his method, his insights, his courage in facing the darkness gives us tools to ask it. We turn now to that legacy, to the ways Freud's ideas have spread, transformed, influenced fields far beyond the consulting room, to the empire of thought he built, even as he doubted, even as he struggled, even as he faced his own mortality. Freud died in London in 1939. He had fled Vienna a year earlier, as the Nazis closed in. He was old, sick, in constant pain from the cancer that had ravaged his jaw. He had endured more than 30 surgeries. He could barely speak, and yet he continued to work, to write, to see patients, to think. In his final days, he asked his physician to help him die. He had endured enough, and the physician, honoring the request, administered a lethal dose of morphine. Freud died as he had lived, on his own terms, facing the reality of death without illusion, without consolation, without hope of an afterlife. But his ideas did not die. They spread, they mutated, they were adopted, adapted, challenged, transformed by thinkers across disciplines. In psychiatry and psychology, psychoanalysis became, for a time, the dominant paradigm. Analysts trained in Freud's method established institutes in Vienna, Berlin, London, New York. They treated patients, they trained new analysts, they built a profession. But psychoanalysis also fractured. Freud's disciples disagreed with him, with each other. Jung broke away, emphasizing archetypes and the collective unconscious. Adler broke away, emphasizing the will to power and the inferiority complex. Later, object relations theorists Klein, Winnicott, Bion shifted focus from drives to relationships. Ego psychologists emphasized adaptation and defense. Self-psychologists, following Kohut, centered the fragility of the self and the need for empathy. Each of these schools claimed to be the true heir of Freud. Each accused the others of betraying his vision, and Freud himself, in his lifetime, was often intolerant of dissent. He could be authoritarian, dogmatic, unforgiving of those who questioned his theories. But the fracturing was also productive. It meant that psychoanalysis did not ossify into a rigid orthodoxy. It evolved, it incorporated new insights, it responded to critique. And today, psychoanalysis is not one thing, it is many things. A family of approaches, all rooted in the recognition that the unconscious matters, that the past shapes the present, that insight and relationship are vehicles of change. Beyond clinical practice, Freud's ideas infiltrated culture, literature, film, art. The language of psychoanalysis, repression, projection, ego, id, Freudian slip entered everyday speech. Writers used psychoanalytic concepts to create complex characters. Filmmakers explored the visual language of dreams. Artists depicted the unconscious. Surrealism, in particular, was deeply influenced by Freud, Dali, Buñuel, Breton. They saw in Freud's work a validation of their own exploration of the irrational, the dreamlike, the hidden. They sought to bypass the conscious mind, to create directly from the unconscious, to produce images that shock, disturb, reveal. In literary criticism, psychoanalysis became a tool for reading texts, for uncovering latent meanings, for analyzing characters as if they were patients, for tracing the author's unconscious conflicts through their work. This approach has been both fruitful and problematic. At its best, it reveals depths in texts that surface readings miss. At its worst, it reduces literature to symptom, flattens ambiguity into diagnosis. In philosophy, Freud's ideas challenged Enlightenment assumptions about rationality, autonomy, and the self. If most of our mental life is unconscious, then who is the I that claims to be in charge? If we are driven by forces we do not understand, then what does freedom mean? Philosophers Ricoeur, Lacan, Foucault, Zizek have grappled with these questions, using Freud as both inspiration and foil. In feminism, Freud's legacy is contested. On one hand, his theories of female development were patriarchal, reductive, offensive. On the other hand, his insistence that sexuality is constructed, not simply biological, opened space for later queer and feminist theorists to challenge gender norms. Freud destabilized the natural, and that destabilization, however unintentionally, was radical. In social theory, Freud's ideas about repression, sublimation, and the discontents of civilization influenced thinkers like Marcuse, Fromm, and the Frankfurt School. They asked, if civilization requires the repression of instinct, is a non-repressive civilization possible? Can we organize society in ways that allow for more freedom, more pleasure, less alienation? Or is the conflict between instinct and civilization inevitable? These are not questions Freud answered, but he made them askable. He gave us a vocabulary, a framework, a way to think about the relationship between individual psyche and social structure. And so Freud's legacy is immense, but it is also contested, because his ideas, however influential, are not beyond critique. They have been challenged, revised, sometimes rejected outright, and we must turn now to those critiques, to the ways Freud has been tested by time, by research, by changing values. Freud was brilliant, but he was also wrong about many things. His theories were often based on small, unrepresentative samples. His interpretations were speculative, sometimes wildly so. He saw patterns where there might have been none. He generalized from his own experience in ways that did not account for culture, class, gender, or historical context. Modern neuroscience has challenged some of Freud's biological assumptions. There is no libido in the sense he meant no measurable psychic energy flowing through mental structures. The id, ego, and superego are not literal brain regions. Dreams are not simply wish fulfillments. They also involve memory, consolidation, threat simulation, and random neural firing. And yet, Neuroscience has also, in some ways, vindicated Freud. The existence of unconscious processing is now well established. We know that most of what the brain does is not available to consciousness. We know that implicit memories formed before language, stored outside awareness, shape behavior. We know that emotional circuits can override rational thought. We know that the past, especially early attachment experiences, wires the developing brain in ways that persist into adulthood. So Freud was right about some things, even if his explanations were wrong. The unconscious exists. The past matters. Insight can change behavior. Relationships are therapeutic. These are not outdated ideas. They are, in modified form, part of contemporary psychology. But psychoanalysis as a therapy has faced empirical challenges. Randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of evidence-based medicine, have often shown that shorter, more focused therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, produce results as good as or better than long-term psychoanalysis, at least for certain disorders. Psychoanalysis is expensive, slow, labor-intensive. It is not accessible to most people, and for some conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, autism, it is not the appropriate treatment. These critiques are fair. They have forced psychoanalysis to evolve, to become more flexible, to integrate findings from neuroscience, attachment research, trauma studies, to develop shorter-term models, to test its claims more rigorously. Some analysts have resisted this evolution. They cling to orthodoxy, to the belief that Freud said everything that needed to be said, but others have embraced it. They recognize that psychoanalysis must change or die, that it must learn from other disciplines, that it must remain open to evidence, to critique, to new perspectives. There are also cultural critiques. Freud's theories were developed in a specific context, fin de siècle Vienna, a bourgeois, Christian, European milieu. Do his concepts apply to other cultures, to non-Western societies, to people whose family structures, values, and experiences of selfhood differ radically from Freud's patients? Some anthropologists and cross-cultural psychologists argue that concepts like the Oedipus complex are culturally specific, that in matrilineal societies, or in cultures where child-rearing is communal, the family dynamics Freud described do not apply, that his theory of the superego assumes a monotheistic patriarchal God and does not fit cultures with different religious structures. These critiques are important. They remind us that psychoanalysis, like any theory, is shaped by its origins, that it must be adapted, not simply imposed, when working with diverse populations. That universalizing from a narrow sample is a form of intellectual colonialism. But some defenders of Freud argue that beneath the surface differences there are universal dynamics, that all humans face the task of managing desire and prohibition, that all cultures impose some form of incest taboo, that all children must separate from caregivers and learn to navigate a social world, that the specifics vary, but the underlying conflicts do not. This debate is ongoing, and it is healthy because it keeps psychoanalysis from becoming dogma. It forces practitioners to question their assumptions, to listen to those whose experiences differ from their own, to remain humble. Freud himself was not always humble. He could be arrogant, defensive, convinced of his own genius, but he was also capable of revision. He changed his theories multiple times over his career. He admitted mistakes. He left questions open. He wrote that psychoanalysis was a beginning, not an end, that others would build on his work, would correct his errors, would go further than he could go, and they have. The psychoanalysis practiced today is not Freud's psychoanalysis. It has grown, deepened, become more relational, more attuned to power dynamics, more aware of its limits. It has learned from feminism, from queer theory, from post-colonial thought, from trauma research, but it still carries Freud's DNA, the commitment to listening, to taking the patient seriously, to assuming that symptoms are meaningful, to believing that the unconscious is real, to insisting that insight matters. And so Freud endures, not as a prophet, not as an infallible authority, but as a thinker whose questions remain urgent, whose method remains powerful, whose courage in facing the darkness of the psyche remains an inspiration. We come now to the end of our journey, to a final reflection on what Freud offers us, on why, more than a century after he began, his work still matters, still challenges, still speaks to something deep in the human condition. Vienna, 1896. The gaslight flickers. The young neurologist sits alone in his study. His colleagues have laughed at him, but he writes. He persists. He begins to map a territory no one has mapped before. The landscape of the hidden mind. We return to where we began, to that moment of audacity and courage, to Freud's willingness to ask questions that others would not ask, to look where others would not look, to listen to what others dismissed as noise. What has Freud given us? He gave us the unconscious, not as a vague notion, but as a structured, lawful domain that can be studied. He showed us that we are strangers to ourselves, that the thoughts we think are only the surface, that beneath them currents run deep and dark and powerful. He gave us the concept of repression, the idea that we defend against what we cannot bear to know, that we push down the intolerable, and that what is pushed down does not disappear. It transforms. It finds another voice, and it speaks through symptoms, through dreams, through the ways we stumble without knowing why. He gave us the insight that childhood matters, that the first years of life lay down patterns that echo throughout adulthood, that we carry the past with us, inscribed in our bodies, our desires, our fears, and that to understand ourselves we must return to the beginning, not to blame, not to excuse, but to see how we became who we are. He gave us the talking cure, the revolutionary idea that words can heal, that putting experience into language speaking what has been unspeakable can change the structure of the psyche. That being heard, truly heard, by another person is a form of transformation. He gave us the recognition that conflict is fundamental, that we are not unified selves, but sites of struggle between desire and prohibition, between instinct and civilization, between what we want and what we are allowed, and that this conflict is not something to be eliminated, but something to be understood, negotiated, lived with. He gave us the method of interpretation, the ability to read the disguised messages of the unconscious, to trace the threads that connect symptom to source, to find meaning in what seems meaningless, to see that nothing is random, that everything we do, say, feel has a history. And he gave us the courage to face reality without illusion, to accept that life is difficult, that suffering is inevitable, that we will not be saved by gods or science or any external force, that we are responsible for our own meaning, that the best we can do is to live with awareness, with honesty, with as much compassion for ourselves and others as we can muster. These gifts are not comfortable. Freud did not offer consolation, he offered clarity. And clarity is often painful, because to see clearly is to see that we are not who we pretend to be, that we are not as rational as we claim, not as moral as we believe, not as free as we assume. But Freud also believed that this clarity is liberating, that what is unconscious controls you, and what is conscious you can work with. That insight does not solve all problems, but it gives you a choice. The ability to see the patterns you have been enacting, and to choose, perhaps, to enact different ones. This is the promise of psychoanalysis, not a cure, not a guarantee of happiness, but the possibility of freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing yourself, from recognizing your own defenses, from seeing how the past has shaped you without being enslaved by it. Freud's work is not finished. It will never be finished, because the unconscious is inexhaustible, because each person's inner world is unique, because the questions he asked, what do we desire? Why do we suffer? How do we become who we are eternal questions, questions every generation must ask anew. And so we read Freud, not as dogma, not as scripture, but as a companion, a guide who walked into the darkness before us, who mapped some of the terrain, who left signs for those who would follow. He was flawed, human, limited by his time, his gender, his culture. But he was also courageous, relentless, willing to risk everything, reputation, career, comfort, in pursuit of truth. And the truths he found are uncomfortable. They violate our self-image. They disturb our sleep. They force us to confront what we would rather deny, that we are not masters of our own house, that we are driven by forces we do not understand, that we are capable of terrible things, that we are, in the deepest sense, divided against ourselves. But these truths are also strangely consoling, because if we are all divided, all conflicted, all struggling with unconscious forces, then we are not alone. Our symptoms are not signs of individual failure. They are part of the human condition, and they can be understood, explored, shared. This is what therapy offers, not the elimination of conflict, but the possibility of being accompanied in it, of having someone bear witness to your struggle, to reflect back to you what you cannot yet see in yourself, to hold the space while you do the work of excavation, of integration, of becoming, slowly, more yourself. Freud believed that analysis does not end, that the work of self-knowledge is lifelong, that there is always more to discover, more to integrate, more to grieve and accept and transform. This is not pessimism, it is realism, and it is in its way an affirmation that the psyche is deep, rich, worth exploring. So as you move through your days, as you dream your dreams, as you stumble over words you did not mean to say, as you feel feelings you cannot explain, remember Freud. Remember that these are not accidents. They are communications, messages from the part of you that does not have words, the part that knows things you do not know you know. Listen to that part, gently, patiently, without judgment. Let it speak. Let it show you what it has been trying to show you all along. You do not need to agree with everything Freud said. You do not need to accept his theories wholesale, but you can take what is useful, the method, the curiosity, the willingness to look beneath the surface, the courage to face what you find there. and you can carry forward the question he asked, the question that animated 50 years of work, the question that remains, even now, unanswered and urgent. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to desire, to fear, to love, to hate, to create, to destroy? What does it mean to live with an unconscious, to be driven by forces you cannot see, to be, in the truest sense, a mystery to yourself? Freud did not answer these questions, but he showed us how to ask them. He gave us the tools, the language, the permission to explore the depths. And in the end, that is enough, more than enough. The work is yours now, to dream, to remember, to speak, to become conscious, to live as fully as you can in the light of what you discover in the darkness. The gaslight flickers. The study is quiet. The young neurologist has finished for the night, but the work continues. In you, in everyone who dares to look within, and the unconscious, patient and timeless, waits, ready to reveal its secrets to anyone willing to listen.